The dying man would not let go of the tile, and that was the only thing that made Reck hesitate. He had learned every rule of the Sump before he learned to read, and the first rule was that the dying gave up whatever they held. A body in the last of its breath was a purse that had already been cut. You only had to be quick and quiet and willing. Reck was all three. He had the broken neck of a wine bottle in his fist, and the man was folded against the slick black stones of the dead-end quay, with a wound in him that no keeper would waste a prayer on. Past the mouth of the alley, the festival lanterns were going up along the water, red and gold, the whole tiered city preening itself for the rising tide. Here in the Sump, the light did not reach. Here there was only the man, and the reek of the flooded lower streets, and the little glazed medallion he clutched against his chest as if it were his own heart, taken out and given back to him to hold. "Please," the man said. He was middens borne by his coat, some artisan who had wandered too low with too much on him. It's rare. Fine work. Mud-back delver. It's for my daughter. She's got no tile of her own. She's got nothing. If you take it, she has nothing." "Neither do I," Reck said. He did not enjoy it. That was a thing the patricians never believed of the Sump, that a boy could take a dying man's last possession and feel it turn in him like a swallowed nail. But feeling it and doing it were separate matters, and only one of them kept you alive. He set his knee on the man's wrist and pried the fingers back one at a time, and the man wept, and the tile came loose into Reck's palm, warm as a coal, though the night was cold. It was a beautiful thing. He would give it that. A disk of fired clay no wider than a plum, glazed in umber and green, and worked into the glaze was the image of a squat, burrowing creature with clever paws and a blunt snout. The Delver. A small shade the tile could call forth, one that could squeeze through cracks and pilfer what larger things could not reach. Reck had seen tiles played in the amphitheater from the cheap standing water at the arena's foot. He knew what they were worth. He knew, too, what they were, the refined essence of some worthy dead soul, rendered down by the keepers into a medallion a living person could keep in their reliquary, that inner store every citizen of Vaunt carried folded somewhere behind the breastbone and call upon at need. The worthy dead became tiles. The unworthy dead became nothing at all. The Sump was full of the unworthy dead. It was the one thing the lagoon city produced in abundance down here, and no one had ever found a use for it. The man had stopped weeping. He had stopped everything. Reck pressed the tile to his own chest, over the place where his reliquary should have opened to receive it, and reached inside himself the way the keepers taught the smallest children in the free chapels. Find the fount, draw the essence, let the tile drink and bond. And he reached, and he reached, and there was nothing there for the tile to drink. There never was. He had 4 founts a person might draw from: stone, gale, ember, tide. The elements every ordinary soul could touch, and Reck could touch none of them. When he reached inward for the clean, cold well of tide, or the bright snap of ember, he found only a single black spring that no keeper had ever named for him without flinching. Cinder, one had finally called it, an outsider fount, a thing that did not belong in a mortal soul. When he drew from it, rage came up his arms like scalding oil, and made him strong past reason and sick past bearing. It was good for breaking a man's jaw. It was good for nothing else. It could not bond a tile of stone or gale, and the Delver was a creature of stone, and so the beautiful medallion sat in Reck's hand, and would not sink into him no matter how he strained, because his soul was the wrong shape to hold it. His soul was the wrong shape to hold anything. He had known that since he was old enough to know he was different from the other gutter children, who at least had one honest element between them. The keepers had a lens relic they used to read a soul, and once, years ago, An old keeper had held it to Reck's eye and gone very still, and had said a thing Reck had never forgotten, that his soul was torn, that where every other person carried a single, whole soul tile at their center, the tile of their own self, the seed of everything they might become, Reck carried a wound, that his had been taken, stolen in infancy, before he could remember, by the woman who had borne him and then vanished. A mother he could not picture, a theft he could not recall, a hole at the middle of himself where the rest of him should have been. He closed his fist around the useless Delver tile and hated the dead man for having a daughter, and hated the daughter for having had a father worth grieving, and hated the whole shining city above him for building itself out of the sorted dead while the Sump drowned. That was when the enforcers came. He heard the water first, the slap of boots through the shin-deep flood that never fully left the lowest streets, and then a light, a shuttered lantern cracked open, and two shapes filling the alley mouth. He knew them the way you know the weather. The big one was Scab, all shoulders and no thought, a cudgel already loose in his hand. The other was worse. She came unhurried, and that was how you could tell her rank. Only someone who never had to hurry moved like Marta moved. She was perhaps 30, lean, with a face like a closed door, and she worked for the Barone of the Sump, old Sesta, who owned the flooded quarter the way the Doge owned the sky. Reck, Marta said, as though marking him present. She looked at the dead man, then at Reck's fist. That his? It's mine now. That's not the question I asked. She came a step closer, and the flood water threw the lantern light up under her chin. Sesta's been watching you. You're wasted robbing corpses in the dark. A boy who can channel the black fount and doesn't die of it. That's worth something in the pens. You're going to come and be worth it. The pens. Sesta's fighting pits, where the Sumps strong were set against each other for the amusement of men who came slumming down from the middens with coin to wager. Reck had spent his whole short life staying out of them, because a boy in the pens belonged to Sesta, and a boy who belonged to Sesta did not belong to himself. No, Reck said, and drew from the black fount. The cinder came up in him like a struck match. His vision narrowed and went red at the edges. His arms sang with a strength that was not his own, and would cost him for hours after. He went at Scab first, because Scab was closer and stupider, and got inside the swing of the cudgel and put the broken bottleneck into the meat of the man's arm, and Scab bellowed and dropped the lantern hissing into the flood. And in the sudden dark, Reck was already turning to run. Marta took him off his feet without seeming to try. He never saw the tile she played. He only felt the shade of it, a low gray thing, all weight, that hit him across the shins like a falling wall and folded him into the water. Then her knee was in his back, and her hand was in his hair, and his face was an inch above the black flood, and the cinder rage was already guttering out and leaving him shaking and emptied the way it always did, and she leaned down close to his ear. There it is, she murmured, almost kind. That's the fight Sesta wants. You'll live longer than you think, boy, if you learn to spend it where it pays. She hauled him up, dripping. The Delver tile was still clenched in his fist. She did not take it, only glanced at it and away, dismissing it, because a tile no one in the Sump could bond was worth less than the clay. Keep your prize, she said. Small mercies. Walk. He walked, because the alternative was the cudgel. But he kept the tile, and as Marta marched him out of the dead end and along the flooded street toward the pens, past the drowned doorsteps and the lantern glow that never came this low, Reck made himself two promises, the way another boy might say a prayer. The first was that he would not stay Sesta's. The second was older and colder and had no shape yet, only a direction. That somewhere in this city, or beyond it, was a woman who had reached into an infant and torn out the center of him, and left him this broken, burning thing to live inside. And that whatever it took, however long it took, he would find her, and he would take back what was his. Behind them, the dead man's daughter would wake tomorrow with nothing. Reck did not let himself think about that. He had enough nothing of his own to carry. 2 tiers above the drowning streets, in a practice loft that smelled of chalk and old varnish, Basto Hintaldi was losing to a boy who wasn't there. "Again," said Maestro Tibbin, not looking up from his ledger. "You flinched." "I did not flinch." "You flinched at the pause. When the shade came at you, and Sorte gave you your moment to raise a shield, you spent it thinking. A moment given by the goddess is not for thinking. It is for having already decided." Tibbin turned a page. "Again." Basto set his jaw and laid his tiles out on the felt before him. He was 17, narrow-shouldered, with the ink-stained fingers of a boy who studied harder than he was gifted. And he came from a branch of a founding house so minor that being a Hintaldi got him a name at the door and nothing else. His reliquary was a cast-off. His elder brothers had picked the family's tiles over like carrion before he was old enough to choose, and left him the thin ones, the middling shades. A reliquary weighted toward gale and measure because the family's strong stone and ember tiles had gone to sons who mattered. He had a single prized tile to his name and had won it himself, and no one in his house had congratulated him for it. He drew essence, the clean, rushing gale fount, and beneath it the cooler, quicker current of measure that let a careful player draw and lay tiles faster than a bold one. And he called forth a shade. The tile flared. The painted image on its face seemed to lift off the glaze and stand up into the air as a figure of light and smoke. A lithe, running thing with a spear, and Basto sent it against the practice shade the maestro's own tile had set opposite. They met. Tibbin's shade struck, and in the instant before the blow landed, the world hitched. The pause of Sorte, the goddess's gift, that sliver of frozen time in which a player might choose to spend a tile in defense. This time Basto did not think. He had already decided. He laid the shield tile flat, and his shade turned the strike and drove its spear home. And Tibbin's shade dissolved into gray smoke and was gone. "Better," Tibbin allowed, which from him was a garland. He finally looked up. "You understand the play. You have always understood the play. What you do not have is the belief that you are permitted to win it. That I cannot teach you. The rising tide will teach you, or it will not." He gathered his own tiles. "Place well, and you enter the office or levy. The step is stirring. The Republic will want its patrician sons blooded on the marsh wall. Place poorly, and you go home to your brothers. I know which I would prefer in your place." When the maestro had gone, Basto stayed in the loft with the felt and the failing light. And he was still there when Esme found him. She came up the stair without announcing herself, which was one of the several hundred things he loved about her. Esme was of a house far above his, betrothed to him by an arrangement of their families that everyone but the two of them treated as a formality, soon to be dissolved in favor of some better match. She had her own reliquary, and she was better with it than he was, and she never once let him forget it, or ever once used it to make him small. "You're brooding," she said, settling onto the felt beside him. "Tibbin told you you'll never believe in yourself, and you've decided to prove him right by sitting in the dark. He's not wrong. He's not right either." She took his ink-stained hand in both of hers. "You see the whole board, Basto. You always have. My cousins swagger in with radiant tiles and no idea what to do with them, and you'll take them apart with a reliquary they'd be ashamed to be seen holding. The tiles don't win the play. The player does." She squeezed his fingers. "Place well. Come back an officer. And when you do, our families can arrange whatever they like. And I will marry you anyway. And there is nothing they can do about it once you have a rank." He looked at her in the last of the light, and something in his chest that had been clenched all afternoon came loose. "Then I'll place well," he said. And for the first time that day, He almost believed it. The amphitheater of sorts stood at the crown of the heights, a great tiered bowl of pale marble open to the sky. And on the opening day of the rising tide it was so full that the crowd overflowed down the processional stairs and pooled at the water steps below. Reck watched it all from the wrong side of everything. He had escaped the pens on the third night, which was 2 nights sooner than Sesta had thought a boy could, and he had done it by being willing to break a thing about himself that Sesta's other fighters would not break. He had drawn so deep on the Cinder fount that he'd torn something and been sick with it for a day. But he'd walked out over a guard who would be limping for a month, and now here he was, filthy and thin and reeking of the low streets, sliding through the festival crowd with a stolen contestant's token in his fist. The token got him onto the arena floor. Nothing could get him to belong there. The play was different up close. From the standing water below, he had only ever seen the light. Down here, he could feel it. The way a called shade seems to press on the air. The way the crowd inhaled together at the pause of sorte. The way the whole ritual was less a game than a liturgy, the sanctioned handling of the dead by the living. Contestants faced each other across low, felted tables set in the sand. Each anted a tile into a keeper's brass bowl. The winner took both. It was, Reck understood at last, exactly what he had done in the alley. Only lawful, only lovely, only up here where it could be admired. He lasted 1 match. His opponent was a soft middens boy with a common reliquary, and Reck should have been outmatched a dozen ways. But he had one thing no soft middens boy had, which was the willingness to reach into the black fount in front of a crowd and let the Cinder come up screaming. His single called Shade, a wretched base thing, a beggar's tile, all he had, moved with a speed and fury that had nothing to do with its worth and everything to do with the rage he was feeding it. And for a moment the crowd went quiet with the strangeness of it. But the Cinder could not bond the tile properly. It could only lash it. And when the middens boy calmly laid a fine tile and called forth a broad-shouldered shade with a shield, the shield held, and Reck's beggar shade guttered and died, and the brass bowl went to the middens boy, and in it went Reck's ante, the only decent tile he owned, a small thing he'd carried since childhood, worth more to him than to anyone. He stood there in the sand while the crowd's attention slid off him like water, and understood that he had just lost the one possession that was his, and that no one would ever give it back, because that was not how any of this worked, up here or down below. The dead man's daughter, now him. The city fed on the same meal at every tier. "You anted your soul's weight in that," said a voice at his shoulder. "You shouldn't have. It wasn't a match you could win with what you brought." It was the studious-looking patrician boy who'd been watching from the next table. He had ink on his fingers and a plain gray coat, and a reliquary that Reck's practiced eye told him was mid-grade at best. A noble, but a poor one, or at least a modest one. The boy was holding out the tile Reck had just lost. The keeper had passed the bowl to the winning middens boy. The middens boy, uninterested in a base tile, had tipped it to this patrician the way you'd hand off a coin too small to bother pocketing. "Yours, I think," the boy said. "It matters to you. It clearly doesn't matter to him." Reck did not take it. In 16 years, no one in the city above or the Sump below had ever handed him a thing that was owed to him and asked nothing back. "What do you want for it?" he said. It was not a question. It was the only frame he had. The boy looked genuinely puzzled. "Want? Nothing. It's yours. Take it." When Reck still didn't move, something crossed the patrician's face. Not pity, which Reck could have hated cleanly, but a kind of embarrassed recognition, as if he'd realized the offer was a stranger and larger thing to Reck than he'd meant it to be. He set the tile gently on the edge of Reck's table and stepped back. "I'm Basto," he said. "In Taldi. Not a house you'll have heard of." A wry twist of the mouth. "Not many have." "Reck," said Reck after a moment. "No house at all." Then we're nearly matched. Basto almost smiled. You fight like something's chasing you. It's not a bad way to fight. It's a terrible way to play. He nodded once, awkwardly, and turned back toward his own table where a keeper was calling his round, and Reck was left standing with his own returned tile burning a hole in the felt in front of him, unable for the life of him to understand what had just happened, only knowing that a debt had been made that he did not know how to carry, because it was a debt of the wrong kind, not owed by him, but owed to the world on his behalf. And he had no ledger for that. He watched Basto play his round. The patrician was good, not with power but with reading, always one lay ahead, forcing his opponent's hand and then punishing the hand he'd forced. He won without ever once reaching for anger. Others were watching too. A knot of high patricians occupied the honor boxes, and at their center sat a young man whose reliquary Reck could feel from across the sand. Radiant tiles. A small fortune's worth, worn like jewelry. That would be Corvallo Saracen, they were saying all around him, the Doge's own heir. And beside him, a smaller, sycophantic shape they named Renzo, laughing at whatever Corvallo laughed at. Corvallo watched Basto win with the sneer of a man who'd never had to. And there was one more Reck marked without meaning to, a pale girl among the contestants, slim and still, whose fount was neither element nor measure, but something grayer and colder. Grave, an outsider fount like his own, though hers smelled of the tomb and his of the pit. She won her match without seeming to try, and her defeated opponent walked away afterward with a strange, slack blankness in his face, and drifted to stand at her shoulder, like a dog brought to heel. Reck watched it, and did not understand it, and filed it away, because in the Sump, the things you didn't understand were the things that killed you. Then he took his returned tile off the felt, and slipped it back into the wounded hollow of his reliquary, where it fit and did not fit, and went out of the shining amphitheater and back down toward the water and the dark, carrying a debt and an idea. The idea was simple. He could not rise up here. The play was built to keep boys like him kneeling. But there was one place in Vaunt where a boy who could channel the black fount and refuse to die might make himself a power. And it was the same place they'd tried to cage him. If he was going to belong to the Sump, then the Sump was going to belong to him first. It took him the better part of the contest weeks to do it, and he did not do it alone, which was the part that surprised him. The first was Bram, a broad, slow-spoken Sump boy a year older than Reck, who'd taken a beating in one of Cesta's collections and been left in the flood to drown as a lesson, and whom Reck pulled out for reasons he could not afterward explain except that he was tired of the city's arithmetic. Bram attached himself thereafter with a loyalty so total it embarrassed Reck. The second was Skell, a wiry woman with scarred hands who'd once apprenticed to a relic smith in the Kiln Deep before debt drove her down to the Sump, and who understood tiles the way Reck understood knives. It was Skell who told him the thing that changed everything. "You can't bond an elemental tile," she said, turning the Delver medallion over in her scarred fingers by the light of a tallow stub. "Fine. Cinder won't drink stone. But Cinder's a fount like any other boy, and where there's a fount, there's tiles that answer to it. Outsider tiles. Cinder tiles. Rare as hen's teeth, and no smith up in the Kiln Deep will make you one, but they exist, and a soul that's built for the black fount could bond them clean." She fixed him with a look. "And there's the other thing. You keep saying your soul's torn, that your own tile got took. Well, a torn thing's got open edges, hasn't it? Edges where a new tile might grow into the wound faster than into a whole soul because the ground's already broken. If you could refine a tile, make one, not steal one, the tearing might be the very thing that lets you do it quick." Reck stared at her. "You're saying the wound could be a door." "I'm saying I don't know," Skell said. I'm saying take it to a keeper who won't sell you to Cesta and ask." The keeper she meant was Penvero, an old man who tended a half-drowned chapel to the paired powers at the very lip of the Sump, where the marble tiers gave way to the flooded streets, and neither the heights nor the low quarter claimed him. He was the sort of keeper the church would have preferred to forget. Too poor to matter, too stubborn to remove. He held his lens relic to Reck's eye the way that other keeper had years before, and where that one had flinched, Penvero only breathed out slowly and set the lens down. "I have read many souls, child," he said. "I have never read one that was robbed. A torn soul, yes. Grief tears them, guilt tears them, the world tears them. But those tear like cloth, and cloth can be sewn. Yours was cut clean by a hand that knew exactly what it was cutting, and the piece was carried off entire. That is not grief. That is theft, and theft of the highest order. To take a living soul's own tile and leave the body breathing? A keeper could not do it. I do not think anything short of a mythic power could do it. Something reached into your cradle, Reck, that had no business in the mortal world at all." "My mother," Reck said. The word tasted of the black fount, so it would seem. Penvero's old eyes were steady on him. "And here is what your smith woman guessed rightly. The wound will take a new tile faster than whole ground would. You can refine a soul tile of your own making, grow it into the cut, and be not healed. The stolen piece is the stolen piece, and no forged thing replaces it, but whole enough to stand. It will take shards of lesser tiles to feed it, and a smith's hand, and your own black fount. And it will hurt in ways I will not lie to you about. But it can be done. The question is not whether you can become strong, child. The question is what you will become strong for." Reck did not have an answer for that. Not yet. But he had the beginning of one, and it had faces now, brams and skells, and the drowned children of the Sump who nobody up the tiers would ever refine into a tile, because the poor died worthless in the city's eyes, and left nothing behind but water. He went for old Cesta at the turning of the contest weeks, when the Baron was fat and careless with the coin the pens had brought in. It was not a clean thing, and Reck would not later pretend it was. Cesta had numbers, and Reck had Cinder, and a smith who knew where the shards were kept, and a friend who would stand in a doorway and not move though it killed him. Reck drew the black fount deeper that night than he ever had, deep enough that his own new-forged tile, a small, ugly thing, a base cinder shade, the first tile his broken soul had ever been able to hold, flared up hot and answered him. And he went through Cesta's men and then through Cesta, and when it was done the pens were his, and the collections were his, and the flooded quarter looked up from its drowned doorsteps and found that its Baron was a 16-year-old with a torn soul and a black fount, and, unaccountably, a conscience he had not asked for. Marta came to him 3 days after. She had been Cesta's chief enforcer. By every rule of the Sump, she should have run or died. Instead, she walked into the pens where Reck now sat, looked at him for a long moment, and said, "You pulled Bram out of the flood." "So?" "Cesta would have let him drown to teach the rest of us. You didn't." She considered him the way she'd considered him in the alley, weighing. "I've served the Sump's Baron my whole life. Never once served one who'd have bothered." She went to one knee, not with servility, but with the flat practicality of a woman choosing her side, while the choosing was still worth something. "It'll answer to you better if I'm the one carrying your word to it. I know every drowned door in this quarter, and who owes what behind it." "Use me." Reck looked at the woman who had put his face in the floodwater and understood that the Sump had just handed itself to him more completely than any pen fight could have, and that he now owned every drowned door and every worthless dead child behind them, and that this was what Penvero had meant. Strong for what? He had his beginning of an answer. It weighed more than he'd thought anything could. Get up, he said. I don't kneel people. There's been enough of that down here. And Marta got up. And that was the day the Sump began, without quite noticing, to belong to a boy who meant to be worth it. The contest did not end when Reck stopped watching it. 2 tiers above the Sump, Basto Hintaldi went on winning. He won carefully, the way he did everything, and by the later rounds the honor boxes had begun to notice him, which was its own kind of danger. It meant invitations. It meant a soiree in a Heights palazzo hung with lantern glass, where the founding houses displayed their tiles the way other cities displayed jewels, and where Basto stood in his plain gray coat among cousins of Esme's who wore radiant reliquaries like collars and looked at him as though a servant had wandered in wearing a guest's face. "The Hintaldi boy," one of them said, not quite quietly enough. "The studious one. They say he's placing well. They say a great many things at contest time." Esme took Basto's arm before he could answer, which was wise of her, because he had not decided whether to. "He'll place better than your brother," she said sweetly, "who I'm told anteed a prized tile to a girl from the Middens on the 2nd day and hasn't been seen at a table since. Shall we compare houses by their sons' results, cousin? Or shall we not?" The cousin found somewhere else to be. Esme kept her hand on Basto's arm. "Don't let them," she murmured. "That's all they have." Don't let them make you flinch. He was learning not to. That was the thing the soiree taught him. Not from Esme, who had always believed in him, but from watching the Heights up close and finding it hollow. These were the people the whole city knelt to, and half of them could not have won a round in the standing water below. Their power was inherited, anteed into their cradles, and they defended it the only way inherited things can be defended, by making everyone beneath them believe the ordering was natural. Basto looked at his betrothed's sneering cousins and felt for the first time in his life not inferior, but unimpressed. And it steadied him more than any garland Tibin could have given. Then the Doge came, and Basto learned a different lesson. There was no announcement. The lantern glass simply dimmed, all at once, as if the light in the room had turned to look at something. And then a radiance came down the great stair, a man, or the shape of a man, wrapped in a light so clean it hurt to hold in the eye. Ottavio Saracen, the luminous doge of Vaunt, who had ruled the lagoon city for longer than any living memory, and who staged his daily sky processions of light for the masses below as a god might stage a sunrise. He did not walk so much as descend, his feet not quite troubling the marble, and the whole gathering of proud houses went down like wheat before wind, and Basto went down with them, because you did not consider whether to kneel to Saracen any more than you considered whether to kneel to weather. The Doge moved among them, gracious, luminous, terrible. He complimented a house on its ancestor tiles. He asked after a matriarch's health, and when a drunken young patrician, some cousin flushed with wine and his own radiant reliquary, laughed too loud and said something Basto did not catch, Saracen turned to him, still smiling, and spoke. That was all. He raised his voice no more than a man asking for salt, but the sound of it struck the young fool across the room like a hurled stone. The patrician's fine coat split down the shoulder as if slashed, and blood came through the cloth. And he cried out and clutched himself and stared at the Doge in dawning horror, while Saracen's smile never wavered. "You would want to be more careful," the luminous Doge said gently, "of what you say in a room that loves you. Others love you less." And he passed on, radiant, and the wounded boy was helped out, weeping. And no one, not one of the proud houses of Vaunt, said a word, because there was nothing to say to a man who could open you with a sentence and call it courtesy. Basto rose from his knee when it was permitted and found that his hands were unsteady. and that the unimpressed feeling of an hour before had curdled into something colder. He had been despising the heights for the hollowness of its power. He saw now that beneath the hollow patricians sat a single power that was not hollow at all, that the whole tottering pyramid of inherited tiles rested finally on one luminous man who could unmake any of them with a word, and chose, for reasons of his own, to let the pyramid stand. That was not a city ruled by houses. That was a city ruled by a god who found it convenient to be flattered. "Basto." Esme's hand was on his sleeve. Her face was pale. Look at Corvallo." He looked. The Doge's own heir, Corvallo Saracen, stood at the edge of the gathering, and there was something wrong with him. He had risen from his knee like the rest, but his eyes were wrong, glassy, fixed, seeing something that was not the room. And he was not the only one. Basto's careful reading eye, the eye that was always one lay ahead, swept the soirée and found 4, 5, 6 of them. Contestants who had done well in the later rounds, standing too still, wearing the same slack blankness that had briefly crossed the face of the boy Reck had watched lose to the pale girl on the opening day. They were arranged, Basto realized with a slow chill, without seeming to be. Spaced through the room, near the doors, near the stair the Doge had descended. Positioned. And at the room's cold heart, unregarded, sipping from a cup she did not drink from, stood the pale girl herself. Lucrezia, the houses called her, the Pale, a contestant of no known family whose grave fount everyone found distasteful, and no one found alarming, because in Vaunt distasteful and dangerous were assumed to be opposites. Her eyes moved once across the blank-faced contestants, checking them the way a puppeteer checks his strings, and then returned to the radiant figure of the Doge, and in them Basto saw an appetite so patient and so total that his blood went to water. She was not entranced. She was doing the entrancing, and every thread she held was strung toward Ottavio Saracen. "We have to tell someone," Esme whispered. "Tell them what?" Basto's mind was racing ahead, 3 lays, 4. That a contestant looks at people oddly? Half the houses want the Doge's favor, and the other half want his death. If we go to the key guard with this, we'll be the ones taken for the plot. And who would believe that anything could threaten him? He had just watched the luminous Doge open a man with a word. That was the trap of it. The Doge's invulnerability was so complete, so daily demonstrated in the sky above the city, that a threat to him was literally unthinkable. And Lucrezia had built her whole design in the one blind spot a god cannot help but have, the certainty that nothing can reach him. The soirée wound to its close with the strings still in place, and the Doge departing in his radiance, gracious to the last, and Basto walked Esme home through the lantern-lit heights with dread sitting in him like a swallowed stone. He had placed well. He would enter the officer levy. The war on the steppe would take him soon, and the final ceremony of the rising tide, the closing rite in the amphitheater, where every placer would be presented and the luminous Doge himself would preside in glory over the sorted dead and the anointed living, was 3 days off. Lucrezia's puppets would all be there. So would the Doge. So, Basto thought, would he? "Whatever she means to do," he said quietly. "She'll do it at the closing, in front of everyone. It's the only place she can be sure he'll come down among us." He stopped at Esme's door and took her hands. "Stay away from the floor. Whatever happens, stay in the high seats near the stairs out. Promise me." "Only if you promise the same." He could not, and she knew it, and she kissed him anyway, and went in. Basto stood in the empty lantern-lit street of the heights, and looked up at the sky where even now the Doge's evening procession of light was unspooling for the delight of the drowning poor 2 tiers below, and understood that in 3 days he would stand on the amphitheater floor while an unthinkable thing became thinkable, and that he had no idea in the world how to stop it, only the certainty that he would be there when it came.
The closing rite filled the amphitheater to its marble lip. Reck was on the floor for it, and that surprised even him.
He had not meant to come back up the tiers. But Skell had heard a thing in the kiln deep, that the rising tide's placers were to be presented before the luminous Doge himself, and that a smith who could get near such a gathering could learn which houses were short of shards and hungry to trade. And Reck had learned by now that the Sump did not survive by staying in the Sump. So he had scrubbed himself passable and used the placer's forged token again, and stood now in the churn of anointed youth on the sand, while the whole shining city looked down. He told himself it was for the shards. He did not entirely believe himself. Somewhere in the churn was a boy in a plain gray coat, who had once handed Reck back a thing that was owed to him. And Reck found he wanted, obscurely, to settle that. He found Basto near the floor's edge, close to Esme, both of them white-faced and watching the crowd rather than the ceremony. When Basto's eye caught his, there was a flare of something. Recognition, and then a flat wariness that Reck did not understand until he remembered how their two peoples saw each other. To a patrician, a Sump boy at the closing rite meant a thief among the plate. "You," Basto said. "How did you?" "Same way you got your rank," Reck said. "Cheated better than the next man." He was braced for the key guard, for a shout, for the old arithmetic. Instead, Basto only looked at him, and some private calculation resolved behind the patrician's careful eyes. "You shouldn't be here," Basto said. "Not because you're low. Because it isn't safe." "Get her out," a jerk of the chin at Esme. "Get anyone you can toward the stairs, if it goes the way I think it will." And Reck, who had come to settle a debt of the wrong kind and found instead that the boy was trying to hand him another one, opened his mouth to ask what, and then the lantern glass of the whole amphitheater dimmed at once, and the light turned to look at something, and Ottavio Serracin came down out of the sky. He descended into the bowl of the arena on a stair of pure radiance, and the crowd went to its knees in a single vast rustle, and Reck knelt with them, because his body did it before his mind could refuse. This close, the Doge was almost unbearable, a wound of light in the shape of a man, and Reck's torn soul twisted toward him with a wrongness he could not name, the black cinder fount at his center guttering and flaring as if it recognized something. He put the feeling away. There was no time for it, because the moment the Doge's radiant feet touched the sand, the blank-faced contestants moved. They came from 6 directions at once, and they moved wrong, in the puppet jerk of bodies driven from outside, and at their center, Corvallo Serracin, the Doge's own heir, drew a radiant tile and called forth a shade of appalling size, a thing of gray death light that lunged for its own father's back. 6 placers, all entranced, all playing at once, their called shades converging on the luminous Doge in a killing braid of light. It was, Reck saw in the frozen half-second, beautifully planned. Nothing could reach the Doge except the Doge's own, his heir, his anointed, the flower of the houses, turned into knives by a hand no one had thought to watch. At the arena's cold edge, unregarded, the pale girl smiled. The Doge did not turn around. He simply was elsewhere, not moving, but having always already not been where the 6 shades struck, and the killing braid closed on empty radiance. And then Ottavio Serracin lifted one luminous hand, and the sound he made was not a word Reck could keep in his head. It went through the 6 entranced contestants, and through the shades they had called, and through the very grave fount that drove them. And it did not merely stop the attack, it turned it. The death light meant for the Doge reversed along the strings that held it, ran back up 6 invisible threads toward the hand that held them, and struck Lucrezia the Pale where she stood. She had time to look surprised. Reck would remember that the puppeteer in the last instant wore the face of the puppet. Her own grave right doubled and redoubled and hurled back down her own strings, unmade her from the feet upward. And where she had stood, there was a smear of gray ash settling onto the marble, and then not even that. The 6 entranced contestants dropped where they stood, strings cut, blank no longer, waking into a horror they would spend their lives failing to explain. Corvallo among them fell to his hands and knees in the sand and vomited and wept, the Doge's heir undone before the whole city, and his radiant father did not so much as glance at him. And Reck was moving. He did not decide to. The old Cinder instinct simply had him, and instead of throwing him at a throat, it threw him between the falling wreckage of the attack and the 2 patrician youths at the floor's edge, between a whipping lash of loosed deathlight and Basto and Esme, so that when the backwash of Lucrezia's unmaking sheeted across the sand, it broke over Reck's raised arms, and the Cinder in him drank the worst of it, and left him scorched and reeling but standing, with Basto's collar in one fist and Esme dragged behind him, all 3 of them alive. For a moment, Reck could not understand what he had done. His whole life he had dreamed, in the black, wordless place the Cinder came from, of exactly this: the luminous Doge unmade, the god of the shining city brought down while Reck watched. He had just watched a woman try it, and when the chance had flared in front of him, some part of him older than the dream had spent his strength not on letting the Doge die, but on keeping 2 heights-born strangers breathing. He looked at his own scorched hands, and did not know the boy attached to them. "You're hit," Basto said, gripping his arm. There was blood on the patrician's face, not his own. "Reck, you stepped in front of it. Why would you—" "I don't know," Reck said, which was true, and was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. Above them, Ottavio Serracin turned at last, radiant and unhurried, and regarded the churning, screaming crowd of his city with an expression that was almost fond. When he spoke again, it was in the ordinary register of a man who has concluded a small piece of business, and a herald's brass conch threw the voice to every corner of the marble bowl. "The step stirs against us," the luminous Doge said. "You have shown me your placers. I will show them the marsh wall. Every youth who placed in the rising tide is levied to the Republic's host as of this hour. You wish to be worthy of Vaunt." The light of him brightened until it hurt. "Be worthy of her walls." And that was the whole of his grief for a heir who had tried to kill him and a girl who had died trying. A conscription, delivered as benediction. The amphitheater roared, half in terror and half in a martial joy it did not understand, and Reck stood scorched in the sand between a patrician boy and the girl he loved, levied now to a war he'd never chosen, bound to Basto by a debt that had finally, dizzyingly, run in both directions, and understood that whatever the grave faction was, and whatever had reached into a god's own court to turn his heir into a knife, the thing had shown its hand tonight, and the city that could not imagine a threat to its Doge had just been made to watch one nearly succeed. "Well," Basto said unsteadily, still gripping his arm, "I suppose we're soldiers now, both of us." He almost laughed. It came out cracked. "Try not to die, Reck of no house. I find I've grown used to owing you." "You don't owe me anything," Reck said. "That's the trouble with you people. You keep giving things away and calling it a debt." But he did not let go of Basto's collar for a moment longer than he needed to, and when he finally released it, something had been decided between them that neither would have been able to name, and that the coming war would test past any naming. The war took them out of the shining city and set them down in the mud. The marsh wall was a long, low rampart of stone and packed earth that ran along the landward edge of the lagoon, where Vaunt's causeways reached out across the salt marsh toward the open steppe beyond. And it was there that the Republic's levy massed through the turning of the season. Reck came to it as a squad sergeant, which no one had intended and everyone regretted,
because the levy captains had looked at a Sump boy who could channel the black fount and decided the safest place for him was in front.
He brought Bram, who would not be left behind, and a handful of Sump-hard youths who had followed him up out of the flooded quarter because a war wage was still a wage, and because Reck, without ever quite deciding to, had become the kind of man that hard boys followed. He hated the war, and he was good at it, and the two facts refused to reconcile. He was good at it because the Cinder that had made him a monster in an alley made him something worse on a rampart. When the steppe skirmishers came probing across the causeways in the gray before dawn, Reck drew the black fount deep and let the rage come up screaming and went along the wall like a fire in a wind. And the ugly little cinder shade he had forged in the Sump had grown, fed on shards Skell smuggled to the front, into something that made grown levymen step back from their own side. He climbed the grades that season the way other men climbed a ladder in the dark, not seeing the rungs, only feeling for the next, from base to common to fine to rare. Each advance paid for in shards and pain and the sick emptied hours that always followed a deep draw. But he climbed. By midsummer, the black fount answered him without tearing anything, and that alone was a kind of healing. He hated it because of what it cost the boys around him, and because of Marta's question, which he had carried up out of the Sump and could not put down. Strong for what? He had thought he knew, on the rampart at first light with the horns going, he was strong to keep his squad breathing. Then a boy from the middens in his own squad died on a step pike, while Reck was 40 feet down the wall being magnificent. And Reck sat with the body in the mud afterward, and understood that being strong for someone and being able to save them were separate things, and that the war did not care which he had. Basto's war was quieter and no easier. He came to the marsh wall an officer of the levy, which in practice meant standing behind men who despised his house and being expected to spend their lives well. He could not go up the wall like a fire. He had no black fount and no wish for one. What he had was the reading eye, the thing Tibbin had never been able to teach him and that had turned out to be the only thing worth teaching. Basto stood on the rampart with the steppe host boiling on the causeways below and saw the shape of it, where the pressure would come, where the line would fold if it folded, which reserve to spend and which to hoard. And he learned painfully, night by night, to trust what he saw and give the order before he'd finished being afraid to. His reliquary was still mid-grade. His men stopped dying at the old rate. Somewhere in the second month of it, a grizzled sergeant who'd sworn never to take orders from a Hintaldi said, of Basto, within Basto's hearing, "The boy sees the board," and it was the finest thing anyone had ever said of him. And he had to turn away so no one would see his face. They fought side by side more than once as the season turned, the fire and the reading eye, and found they worked. Reck would break a place in the steppe line by sheer black fount fury, and Basto would see, 3 lays ahead, what the break would let them do. And between them they held stretches of the marsh wall that by every reckoning should have fallen. In the long muddy watches between assaults they talked, warily at first, and then not. A Sump thief and a poor patrician, discovering they had more in common than either had with the people they'd been raised among. The same contempt for inherited swagger, the same private conviction that the ordering of Vaunt was a lie the powerful told to keep the weak kneeling. Basto told Reck about Esme, whom he wrote to nightly, and who was safe, he thanked the paired powers, back in the heights. Reck told Basto about the drowned children of the Sump, who left no tiles, and watched the patrician go quiet and thoughtful, in a way none of his own kind ever had. And there was a thing that neither of them could make sense of, that they circled again and again in the dark. The war itself. "It's wrong," Basto said one night, low over a shielded lamp behind the rampart. "The whole shape of it. The steppe clans have raided the marsh edge for 100 years. A village burned, a caravan taken, and gone by spring. They don't unite. They've never united. They hate each other worse than they hate us. He turned a captured step token over in his fingers, frowning. And now there's a warlord out there, Targoth they call him, who's pulled a dozen clans under one horsetail standard and marched them at our walls in the one season the Republic could least afford it. The same season the Doge's heir was turned into a knife at the closing rite. That's not a raid finding its moment. That's a raid being given one. You think somebody made this war, Reck said. I think somebody wanted it made. Bastow's careful eyes found his in the lamplight. And I keep coming back to the same question, and I don't like where it goes. Who benefits? Not the steppe. Targoth will break his clans against these walls, and they'll scatter again the moment he falls. Not the houses. Their bleeding sons into the mud. There's one power in this city that could stitch a dozen hating clans into a single fist and set them at his own walls in the exact hour of a grave faction plot, and could do it so far above us that we'd never see the hand. He did not say the name. On the marsh wall, with the Doge's light unspooling nightly in the sky behind them, you did not say the name. But Reck felt the black fount at his center twist the way it had twisted when the Doge came down out of the sky, that wrongness of recognition, and said nothing, and filed it away in the place where he kept the things that could kill him. The season broke at last, as everyone had known it must. Targoth had spent the summer probing, learning the causeways, wearing the levee thin, and when the autumn tides ran high and the marsh flooded the approaches he'd been waiting for, the whole steppe host came at once. Not at the causeways where Vaunt was strong, but across the drowned marsh itself, on rafts and horse-hide floats, and the backs of great pale marsh beasts the clans had broken to war. A tide of them, out of the salt dark, with Targoth's horsetail standard at the crest. Reck was a fire on the wall, and Bastow was a reading eye behind it, and it was not enough, because there was too much water and too many of them, and the marsh had turned against its own defenders. The marsh wall held for a night and half a day. Then, near the westernmost causeway where the flood ran deepest, it broke. The packed earth undermined, the stones slumping into the risen water, and the steppe host poured through the breach and onto the causeway proper, the last stone road into the heart of Vaunt. Reck fought his way to Bastow through the collapse with Bram at his back and half his squad gone, and the two of them stood on the failing wall with the city's last causeway open behind them and the horde flooding across it, and there was nothing left to hold with. The levee was breaking. The lagoon city lay open to the steppe for the first time in living memory, and above them the sky was very bright, because the luminous Doge's evening procession of lights was beginning, unspooling in ribbons over a city about to fall, as if he did not know, or did not care, or had known all along. Then the light stopped moving. The whole sky hitched, the way the world hitched at the pause of Sorte, but vast, total, the very air going still. The war on the causeway froze, steppe and levee alike, mid-blow, mid-scream, as a slow moment came down over all of them at once. And Reck felt the cinder in him lock and the black fount go silent, and understood with a lurch of animal dread that this was not the goddess's small mercy, but her great one, the thing the keepers spoke of in hushed voices and the crowds prayed to see once in a life. Above the breached causeway, the ribbons of the Doge's light were pulling together, weaving, rising, and out of them a shape was building itself against the frozen sky. Tears of pure radiance, a great bowl of light forming over the whole battlefield, an arena where no arena could be. The paired powers had come. The war had become a contest, and Vaunt was about to learn what its god was truly for.
Reck was lifted out of the world without moving an inch. One instant he stood on the breached wall with a broken pike in his fist.
The next he sat, weaponless, in a seat of woven light, in a great, radiant bowl that hung above the frozen causeway where an arena had no business being. The whole of both hosts was there, levy and steppe together, thousands of them, enemies a heartbeat ago, seated side by side in the tiers of the firmament amphitheater, and unable to lift a hand, because the paired powers had reached down and seized the war, halted it mid-slaughter, and remade it into the only thing Vaunt understood as sacred, a play. When the goddess of fortune and the god of measure grew weary of watching mortals decide their fates by mud and iron, the keepers taught they would sometimes seize a great contest into their own hands and make of it a spectacle for their pleasure. And woe to any who tried to leave the seats they had been given. Reck reached for the cinder and found it gone, stripped from him along with everyone else. In the stands, he was nothing. He could only watch. Below, on a floor of light, two figures stood. One was Targoth. The warlord of the steppe was smaller than his legend, a wiry, weathered man with gray in his war plates and eyes like a hunting bird's. And he stood on the divine floor with his horsetail standard planted beside him, and looked up at the tiers of woven radiance without fear, which told Reck more about him than a season of war had. The other was the luminous doge. Ottavio Saracen descended to the arena floor as he descended to everything, on a stair of his own light, and where he passed the radiance of the paired powers themselves seemed to dim in deference. He was the champion of Vaunt. That was the shape the seizing had chosen. The god of the shining city against the warlord of the marsh dark, and the whole frozen war made audience to it. And the outcome of the play, the crowd understood this in its bones, without being told, would be the outcome of the war. Win here and win there. This was what the Doge was for. This was why a god ruled Vaunt, so that in the last extremity, when the walls broke, he could reach up into the sky and turn a lost battle into a single duel and win it. And he began to win it. Reck had thought he understood power. He had watched Saracen unmake Lucrezia with a word. He had not understood anything. On the floor of light, the Doge called forth shades out of a reliquary that must have held the refined essence of centuries. Founder heroes, ancient champions, the greatest dead of Vaunt's whole long line, each one a figure of such grade that the crowd moaned to see it. And Targoth met them. The warlord's own reliquary was a savage marvel. Steppe tiles refined from clan champions and marsh beasts and things that had no name in the lagoon city, and he played them with a low cunning that had nothing of the amphitheater's courtly measure in it, and everything of 100 years of rating. He was good. He was better than good. For a while, in the tiers, the steppe host dared to hope, but the Doge was not a man playing a play. He was a radiant power condescending to the form of one, and slowly, remorselessly, the gap showed. Saracen turned Targoth's fiercest shades aside as a man turns a child's blow. He answered savagery with an ancient, terrible measure, and one by one the warlord's tiles guttered and his called champions dissolved into smoke, until at last Targoth stood on the floor of light with his reliquary nearly spent and his horsetail standard leaning, and the Doge before him wholly untouched, radiant, faintly, dreadfully amused. The warlord did not beg. Reck gave him that too. He drew his last tile and played it, and it was not enough, and he knew it was not enough, and he played it anyway, standing to his full small height beneath a god. It was at that moment, with every eye in both hosts fixed on the warlord's doomed last play, with the Doge's attention wholly on the small, brave man before him, that the killing came. Reck almost missed it, and so did everyone. There was a figure among the champions the Doge had called forth, a shade like the others, a tall smoke and light shape that had stood at Saracen's own shoulder through the whole duel as one of his ancestral summons. Reck had marked it and dismissed it. Now, in the instant the Doge leaned in for the final measure against Targoth, the shade at his shoulder turned. Turned wrong. Turned with a will of its own that no summoned shade should have. And it was not a shade at all, but something that had worn the shape of one, folded itself into the Doge's own called host, hidden in the one place a god would never think to guard, among his own dead.
Reck saw it and could not move, and could not shout, and could not do anything at all but watch the thing that had hidden among Sarachine's ancestors reach out and lay a single gray tile against the luminous Doge's radiant back. It was so small. That was the horror of it. After the whole vast spectacle of founder heroes and warlord champions, the killing of the god of Vaunt was one small gray medallion, pressed to his spine by a hand that had waited, patient beyond mortal patience, for the one heartbeat in which even a radiant power looked entirely away. The Doge stiffened. The light of him, the clean, unbearable radiance that had ruled the lagoon city for longer than memory, that unspooled nightly over the drowning poor as proof that a god watched over them. The light flickered, guttered, and went out.
Ottavio Saracen, the luminous Doge of Vaunt, fell to the floor of the arena that his own gods had built, and did not rise, and the radiance that had been his life ran out of him across the woven light, and left only a man, only a body, only the sudden and total dark of a sky with nothing in it. The firmament amphitheater screamed. Reck screamed with it, though he could not have said for whom, for the god he had dreamed 1,000 times of killing, whose death now opened under him like the marsh under a broken wall.
The thing that had struck the blow lifted its head, and in the last instant before the seized arena tore itself apart, Reck saw it shed the borrowed shape of the shade and become, briefly, something else. A tall, pale woman, or the idea of one, beautiful and cold, and turning unmistakably and impossibly to look up through the collapsing tears of light directly at him, at Reck, at the Sump boy with the torn soul, as if of all the thousands in the frozen war, she had come for him alone. Then the seizing broke. The bowl of woven radiance came apart like a dropped lantern. The frozen war lurched back into motion, and the whole vast play collapsed downward, toward the breached causeway and the risen flood. Thousands of unfrozen soldiers, a leaderless city, a horde already through the wall, and no god left in the sky to turn any of it into a single, winnable duel ever again. The protector of Vaunt was dead. The war was lost. And the pale thing that had killed him was reaching for Reck across the ruin, her hand closing on the black wrongness at his center that had twisted toward the Doge from the first. And Reck understood, one instant before the dark took him, that she had not looked at him by accident, and that whatever she was, she knew him. There was a tearing, and then a stillness, and Reck stood in neither the arena nor the world. He was on the causeway. He could see it, the broken stone, the risen flood, the war grinding back into motion below. But he stood apart from it, in a pocket of stopped air before a wound in the sky. The wound hung over the ruined causeway like a rent in wet cloth, and through it Reck could see a place that was not Vaunt. Tiers of black basalt under a sky the color of a banked coal. A court of pale cold fires, an architecture built to a scale that made the amphitheater a child's toy.
The infernal rent, some old keeper's word for it, surfaced in him, the tear through which the outsider founts leaked into the mortal world. His whole life, the black cinder at his center had leaked from somewhere. He was looking at the somewhere, and in the mouth of the rent, between him and the coal-lit court, stood the pale woman who had killed the Doge. She had not the shape she'd worn among the ancestors, nor quite the shape of a woman, She flickered between forms the way heat flickers over stone, tall and cold and beautiful in each of them. And in each of them her eyes were the same. And Reck knew those eyes, though he had never in his remembered life seen them. Knew them in the black, wordless place the cinder came from. And the knowing turned his stomach over. "There you are," she said. Her voice was low and warm and terrible, a mother's voice used as a blade. "How you've grown, little cinder. I have watched you a long while. I watched you take that dying fool's tile in the alley and fail to bond it, and I laughed, because of course you failed. You are not built to hold their tiles. You are built to hold mine." She tilted her flickering head. "Do you know me yet? Reach into that torn place at your center and tell me you do not know me." He reached, and he knew her, and it was the worst thing that had ever been done to him. "You," Reck said. His voice came out of him wrong. "You're the one who took it. My soul tile. When I was an infant, yes." She said it without a flicker of shame, and that was somehow the cruelest part. "I am Ivan, of the unyielding seat, a noble of this court you are so afraid to look at. And I am your mother, little cinder, though I see the word tastes of ash to you. I bore you in the mortal world for a purpose, and I took the seed of your soul as one takes a seed from a fruit, and I carried it home with me, and I left the fruit to rot on the low tiers of a drowning city to see whether anything of mine could survive there. And here you stand." Something almost like pride moved across her flickering face. "You survived. You always were the strongest thing I made." "Made," Reck repeated. The word opened under him. "For a purpose. You said, a purpose. Do you not wonder why you, alone in that whole city, twist toward the light of its doge? Why the black fount at your center recognized him?" Yvain's smile was slow and cold, and knew exactly where the knife was going. "I did not conceive you on the low tiers, little cinder. I conceived you at the very top of them. Your father is the man I killed today, was the god of that shining city, was Ottavio Serracin, the luminous doge of Vaunt." She let it land. "You are the son of a demon of the unyielding seat and the god-king of the lagoon. You are the only creature in the mortal world with the blood to sit that throne and the blood to break it. That is what you were made for. That is what you are for. And I have come, now that your father is out of the way, to collect what is mine and take you home to your inheritance." Reck stood in the stopped air before the rent and could not breathe. It was too much, and it was all at once, and it fit. That was the horror, that every wrong thing about his whole life clicked into place around this. The torn soul, the black fount that no mortal carried, the way he had twisted toward the doge, the impossible fact of a Sump boy who could stand where he'd stood. He was not an accident of the drowning quarter. He was a design. He had been grown.
"Come home,"
Yvonne said again, and now she reached into herself and drew something out and held it up between them in the coal light of the rent, and Reck's whole torn center lunged toward it before his mind could catch him. A tile. A single tile, glazed in a color he had never seen and knew instantly, in the marrow, in the wound. His. His own soul tile, the seed of himself, the missing center that had left him this broken, burning thing to live inside for 16 years. She held it out to him across the tear in the world. "Take it," she said, gently now, and the gentleness was worse than the blade. "Join me. Step through, and I will give you back the piece of yourself I carried away, and you will be whole for the first time in your life. Whole and strong and elevated past anything that drowning city could make of you. No more torn soul, no more reaching into the dark and finding it empty. Come home to the unyielding seat, and be my son, and be whole." Her flickering eyes held his. "You want it. I made you to want it. I can feel you wanting it from here.
And he did. That was the thing Reck would carry the rest of his life. The thing he never told anyone but Penvaro. That he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. That his torn soul screamed toward the little tile in her hand with a hunger 16 years deep. That for one long, unbearable moment he was going to step through the rent and take back himself and be whole and let the drowning city drown. Then behind him, faint through the stopped air, he heard the war. He heard the levee breaking on the causeway. He heard, or thought he heard, Bram's voice somewhere in the ruin shouting his name. He thought of Basto in the collapse, with the horde flooding through. Of Esme, safe in the heights that was no longer safe from anything. Of Marda and Skell and Penvaro and the drowned quarter that had, without his ever quite agreeing to it, become his. The thing Penvaro had asked him about in the half-drowned chapel.
Strong for what? Here at last was the whole of the answer, held out to him in a demon's hand. He could be strong for himself, be made whole, be a son and a prince of the unyielding seat, if he would only turn his back on every living thing that had ever, against all the city's arithmetic, been kind to him. No, Reck said. Ivan went very still. No? You heard me. His voice shook and did not stop. You took the middle out of me and left the rest to rot, and now you want the rest, now that it turned out to be worth something. That's not a mother. That's a woman collecting a debt she made herself owed. He was crying, he realized, distantly. With rage or grief or both. It did not change anything. I've been broken my whole life. I know how to be broken. I don't know how to be the kind of thing that walks away from people who need me so I can be whole. I'm not going to learn it from you. He forced himself to look away from the tile, from his own stolen center held out in the coal light, and it was the hardest thing his body had ever done. Keep it. Keep the piece of me. I'd rather stay torn and stay here than be whole and be yours. For a long moment, Yvonne did not move, and something crossed her flickering face that might, in a creature capable of it, have been grief. Then it closed and went cold, and she drew the little glazed tile back into herself. As you like, she said, and now her voice was winter. Understand me, little Cinder. I do not offer twice. You had your soul in reach, and you chose a drowning city over your own wholeness. And that is a wound you will carry now for as long as I carried your tile. When you come to want it again, and you will want it more with every year you rot. You will have to come and take it. From me. And I am a noble of the unyielding seat, and you are a torn thing from the low tiers, and I promise you, you are not strong enough. She was already withdrawing into the rent, into the coal-lit court, her flickering shape diminishing up the black basalt tiers. Enjoy your city while it stands. My betters are coming for it, and they will not offer it anything at all. The rent closed. The stopped air let go, and Reck was standing on the broken causeway in the roar of a lost war, in a leaderless city, with his back turned forever on his own stolen soul, and the black fount at his center burning colder and emptier than it ever had. Because now, for the first time, he knew exactly what was missing, and exactly who had it, and exactly how far out of his reach it was. He wiped his face and drew the cinder and turned toward the sound of Bram calling his name. Because that, at least, he could still do. He could still stand between the drowning and the flood. It was all he had chosen instead of himself, and it would have to be enough. Basto never reached the high seats he'd begged Esme to keep to. By the time the seizing broke and dropped the war back onto the causeway, the wall was already gone, and the thing that came through the breach was not the step post. The step had broken the wall. Something else came through it. With the Doge dead and the sky empty, the infernal rent hung open over the causeway like an unhealing wound, and out of it came the vanguard of the unyielding seat, not the horsetail savagery of Targoth's clans, but a cold, ordered horror, pale things and gray things, a court on the march into a city whose god had just been peeled off it. The steppe warriors themselves fell back before it, appalled. They had wanted plunder, not this. Targoth's host, leaderless and reeling from the divine duel, scattered into the marsh, and the court poured through the gap they'd made and took the lagoon city tier by tier, while the levy died in the streets. Basto fought his way toward the heights because Esme was in the heights, and he was too late. And he had known he would be too late from the moment the wall came down, and he ran anyway. He found her in the palazzo of her house, or found where she had been. The court had come up the tiers faster than any mortal army could, and one of its captains had come here, to the high houses, where the tiles were richest, a tall, pale lord who moved like cold water, and drank light the way the Doge had shed it. Malco, the survivors who could still speak would later call him, a vampire lord of the unyielding seat, and he had come into the house of Esme's family for its ancestor tiles, and found the family defending them, and he had gone through them like a scythe through wheat. Esme had not run. That was the thing Basto could not bear. Kneeling afterward in the wreck of the great hall, she had stood with her house's tiles and fought, because she was better with a reliquary than any of her sneering cousins, and braver than all of them together. And she had made Malco work for it. There were 3 of the court's gray things unmade on the marble around her doing, her last careful reading eye play. And it had not been enough. Because a mortal contestant, however gifted, is not a lord of the unyielding seat. And Malco had taken her the way the strong always took the worthy in Vaunt. But he had not left her a body to grieve. That was the second horror, and the one that made Basto's grief into something colder and more useful than grief. Malco was a lord of a court that valued the worthy dead as Vaunt valued them, and Esme had died worthy, and so the vampire lord had done to her what the keepers did to the great dead of the lagoon. He had harvested her. Where Esme should have lain, there was nothing. And at Malco's belt, when Basto glimpsed him departing up the tier, there hung a new tile, glazed in a color Basto knew the way Reck knew his own. A soul tile, freshly refined, still warm. Esme's essence. Esme's self. Taken and worn like a trophy by the thing that had killed her. Basto did not scream and did not weep, though both were in him. He had learned something on the marsh wall about the difference between feeling a thing and acting on it, and he made himself into the reading eye one last terrible time and saw the whole board of what was left. Esme was not gone. That was what the harvest meant, the thing that would either save him or destroy him. Her tile existed. Somewhere in the court's holdings, her self persisted, refined, a shade that could be called forth. Forgetful of herself, surely, newly made tiles were always half lost, a frightened thing that no longer knew its own name. But there, recoverable, not dead the way the drowned children of the Sump were dead, into nothing. Held. And a thing that is held can be taken back. He was still on his knees with that thought when Hecabe's things closed on him. He never had a chance. His reliquary was spent from the marsh wall. The court held the tier, and the one who commanded here was not Malco, but a taller, colder power. A lich. A bone sorceress of the grave fount, whom the court called Hecabe. And she wanted the high house's living heirs as much as their dead ancestors, because a hostage of a founding house was a lever on a city not yet fully taken. Basto was a Hintaldi, minor but named, and an officer of the levy besides, and Hecabe's gray things took him alive, and bound the founts out of him with a collar of cold iron,
and dragged him up through the falling city to a redoubt the court had made in the shell of the Doge's own palazzo, and threw him into the dark among the other useful living. He could have broken then. He nearly did.
But Hecabe made a mistake that a mortal jailer would not have made, and that a creature of the unyielding seat could not help. She was proud, and she let her captives see the court's trophies, the way a great house displays its ancestor tiles to overawe a guest. And so, on the first night of his captivity, Basto Hintaldi, collared and founts bound in the dark of a corrupted palazzo, looked up and saw, set among the court's harvest on a shelf of black basalt, a small, warm tile glazed in a color he knew, and beside it, playing at some cold amusement, the vampire lord Malco turning that same tile idly in his pale fingers, calling forth for a moment the frightened, half-formed shade of a girl who no longer knew her own name, and laughing at her confusion, and putting her away again. Something in Basto that had been grief became, in that moment, a blade. He knelt in the dark and did not weep and did not rage, and he made himself the reading eye, and he looked 3 lays ahead and 4, and he began, cold, patient, planning past his own captivity toward a board that did not yet exist, to work out exactly how a founts-bound prisoner might refocus a broken soul into something sharper than the thing that broke it, and recover a tile from a lord who wore it as a trophy, and put a blade of light through the exact center of the pale thing that had taken Esme from the world. "I'm going to get you back," he said, into the dark, to a girl who could not hear him and no longer knew her name. "I'm going to get you back, and I'm going to kill him for it, and I am not going to flinch." It was the first vow he had ever made without being afraid, and the fear that had ruled his whole life, Tibin's despair, his brother's contempt, his own certainty that he was not permitted to win, was simply gone, burned clean out of him, and in its place was a purpose so total it was almost peace. Above the fallen city the sky was empty of the Doge's light, and into that emptiness, up through the infernal rent, something vast was descending, something that made even Hecabe grow still, and Malco cease his cruel amusements. A power beside which the Lich and the vampire lord were mere lieutenants, come at last to take not just the city, but the whole order of the world. Basto felt it arrive the way you feel a storm change the pressure of the air. He filed it away with the rest, cold and clear and unafraid, and went back to his planning, because whatever was coming, the board was the board, and he meant to be reading it when the last lay came. The thing that came down through the rent had a name, and when it spoke the name itself, the corrupted city shuddered to its drowned foundations. Reck heard it from the Sump, where he had fought his way back down through the falling tiers to the one part of Vaunt the court had not bothered to take, because the court, like the Doge before it, saw no worth in the drowning poor. He had gathered what was left, Bram, half dead and grinning, Skell with her scarred hands and a satchel of shards, Marda, who had held the Sump's drowned doors through the whole collapse and lost fewer of her people than any captain up the tiers, old Penvero in his half-drowned chapel, unmoved by the end of the world. They were alive because they were beneath notice. Reck stood among them in the floodlight and felt the pressure of the sky change, and knew, the way he now knew too many things, that his mother's betters had arrived. Axe, the corrupted city learned to call it. The unmade sovereign, primarch of the unyielding seat, first and eldest of the powers that leaked their founts into the mortal world. And it had not come to Vaunt for tiles or tribute or a throne. It had come, it announced from the black basalt tiers its arrival had raised over the Doge's palazzo, to end a thing older than Vaunt, older than the lagoon, older than the paired powers themselves. Reck went up, once, cloaked and careful, to see it, because Penvero said a man should look at the thing he means to fight. He looked, and wished he had not, and was glad he had. Axe was not shaped like a demon or a god or a beast. It was shaped like an absence wearing a crown, a great cold hollow in the middle of the world, vast beyond the Doge's radiance, and where it moved, tiles unmade. That was its power and its purpose both. The court under Hecabe and Malco harvested the worthy dead into tiles, as Vaunt did, as the paired powers had decreed since the First Age. But Axe did not harvest. Axe ate. It took a tile, a shade, an ancestor, a soul refined and kept, and it did not use it or wear it or trade it. It devoured it into nothing, into the true nothing that the drowned children of the Sump went into, the nothing beyond even the grave fount. And the soul that had been refined and kept was simply gone, undone, as if it had never lived at all. "It hates the whole arrangement," Penvero said quietly, when Reck came back gray-faced to the chapel. "Think on it, child. The paired powers made a bargain with death. The worthy dead are not lost, but refined, kept, honored, used by the living."
It is a cruel bargain in its way. You have said so yourself. You who have watched the poor die into nothing while the rich become tiles. But it is a bargain against oblivion, and this thing, this sovereign, calls the bargain a cage. It says the gods have chained even death, hoarded every soul that ever lived into little painted medallions to be played in their pretty contests, and that the only freedom left in creation is to unmake, to eat every tile and every shade and every kept soul until nothing is held any more, until death means death, and not a shelf of trophies, until the paired powers have nothing left to rule. The old keeper's hands were not quite steady. It offers oblivion and calls it liberty. And the terrible thing, Reck, the thing I dare not say up the tears, is that a man who has watched the poor die into nothing while the rich are kept can almost understand the argument. "You can't," Reck said. "You can't almost understand it. It wants to unmake everyone, Esme, your worthy dead, and my worthless ones both. It doesn't want the poor kept too. It wants the rich unkept, everything gone, the whole world emptied to prove a point about cages." He heard his own voice hardening into something he recognized and did not shy from it. "I've had enough of powers that offer you your freedom if you'll only burn down everyone who ever mattered to you. My mother offered me mine. I'm getting tired of the price." Word of the sovereign's purpose ran down even to the Sump, and where it ran, it did a strange thing. It made allies of the friendless. The court's own lieutenants grew uneasy. Hecabe and Malco had harvested a city's worth of tiles, and now watched their sovereign propose to eat their trophies along with everyone else's. The scattered steppe, hiding in the marsh, understood that a thing which unmade souls would not spare theirs. And in the drowning Sump, Reck found himself, without ever having asked for it, the one power in Vaunt gathering a resistance instead of a following. He did not want it. He remembered saying strong for what was a question he'd answered on a broken causeway with his back to his own soul. And here was the answer demanding more of him than he'd known it could. "They'll die if I lead them," he told Marta, low in the flood dark. "I'm one torn boy with a black fount. I turned down being whole. I turned down a throne. I've got no soul tile of my own and a mother who says I'll never be strong enough to take it back. And now you want me to stand between this city and a thing that unmakes gods?" Marta looked at him the way she had in the pens, weighing, and said the thing that settled it. "You pulled Bram out of the flood. You wouldn't kneel me when I offered. You turned down being whole so you could come back here to us." She shrugged, hard-handed and plain. "I don't follow you because you're strong, boy. There's stronger things in the sky right now than you'll ever be. I follow you because you're the only power in this whole city that ever looked down. That's the one nobody up there's got. Use it." He did not have an answer for that, any more than he'd had one for Penvero, but he stopped arguing. The gods answered before he could plan.
On the third night of the sovereign's reign, the sky over Vaunt hitched again. The vast total stillness of the pause made whole, and the ribbons of a dead god's light that still hung tattered over the city drew together and wove and rose, tier upon tier of radiance, the firmament amphitheater building itself once more over the drowned lagoon. But it was greater this time, greater than the seizing that had killed the Doge, a stadium of light that spanned the whole city and hung against a coal-lit sky. The paired powers had watched the unmade sovereign propose to end them, and they had made their answer in the only language a god of fortune and a god of measure knew. A voice came down over Vaunt. Two voices, braided. Sort and Ordine, fortune and measure. And it did not thunder. It invited. You would unmake the order of the kept dead, the paired powers said, to the sovereign, to the court, to the drowning city, to the marsh and the steppe and the whole reeling world. We will not unmake it by force. Force is your tongue, not ours. We will decide it as it has always been decided in this place. A contest. The greatest contest, with the greatest ante. Let champions come to the firmament amphitheater, of the court and of the city, of the living and the harvested dead, and let them play. And the ante of this play shall be Vaunt itself, and the order of the world with it. Win, and the cages you hate are broken, and the kept are freed into your oblivion.
Lose, and the bargain stands, and you are put down into it. Come to the arena of light. Come and play for everything. The rent flared. The sovereign, vast and cold and hollow, laughed. A sound like the last tile in the world being eaten, and accepted, because a thing that has come to end the god's game will always accept a chance to end it at the table where they thought themselves safe. And in the drowning Sump, Reck felt the invitation settle over the city like a shroud of light, and understood that the last and largest thing had come, that the whole war and the whole world had funneled down to a single play in an arena the gods had built, with everything he had ever loved anteed against a sovereign that unmade souls, and that somewhere in the coming brackets of that contest would stand his mother, with his stolen soul at her belt, and the vampire lord who wore Esme as a trophy, and the unmade sovereign itself, and that a torn boy from the flooded quarter was expected to walk into the arena of the gods and win it all back. "Get me to the kiln deep," he said to Skell, and his voice had stopped shaking. "Before the contest opens, there's a thing I have to do first. I've been torn my whole life, and I'm not walking into that arena in pieces." He looked up at the vast, woven light hanging over the fallen city. "If I'm going to play the gods for everyone I love, I'd better go in as whole as a stolen soul will let me." Penvero would not let him go to the kiln deep. "The wholeness you need is not in a smith's forge," the old keeper said, "and you know it, or you would not have come to my chapel first." So Reck came to the half-drowned chapel instead, and knelt on its wet stones, and let the old man hold the lens relic to his eye one last time. Penvero was quiet a long while. Then, "There is more here than a wound now. There is a peace." He lowered the lens. "When the demoness offered you your soul tile and you refused it, Reck, refusing it did something. You looked at the stolen center of yourself, named it, wanted it, and turned away by choice. You did not close the wound, but you woke what was still in it." He set his old hand over Reck's breastbone. "There is a shade in you, child. Small, frightened. It has been in you all along, in the torn place, too hurt to speak. The part of the soul that could not be carried off with the tile, because it was too deep-rooted. The memory of the self, the child you were before she cut you. It has forgotten almost everything, but it is there, and it is yours. And if you will go down into that dark and find it and take it up, you will not be whole, the tile is still hers, but you will be gathered. You will have your own past back. And a torn thing that remembers itself is a great deal stronger than a torn thing that does not. Reck did not want to go into that dark. He had spent 16 years not going into it. But he had walked away from his own soul on a broken causeway, and he could not do a harder thing than that had been. So he closed his eyes in the wet chapel light and reached, past the black cinder fount, into the torn place at his center, and went down. It was worse than the war, and quieter than the war. He found the child in the dark the way you find a sound in a flooded house, a small, huddled shade, no bigger than the infant he must once have been, curled around the raw edges of the wound and shaking, having crouched there in terror for 16 years while the rest of him grew up hard and rageful in a drowning city. It did not know him. It flinched from him. And Reck, who had never in his remembered life been gentle with anything, knelt in the dark of his own soul and was gentle with the frightened child that was himself, and coaxed it, and named it with the name the city had given him because it had no other, and took it up, and let it come home into the torn place where it had always belonged. The merging was not painless. Nothing that mattered ever was. But when it was done, Reck opened his eyes in the chapel and had his past back. All of it, even the part before memory, which the child shade had carried curled around itself all these years, like a swallowed coal.
He remembered the infernal court. He remembered the black basalt tiers and the coal-lit fires, an infant's blurred remembering, but there, the first months of his life spent not in the sump, but in the unyielding seat, in his mother's cold keeping, before she'd carried his stolen tile home and set the emptied rest of him down to rot in the lagoon. He remembered Yvonne's face bent over him, testing him, weighing him the way she weighed everything, and he remembered this was the thing worth the pain, the thing Penvarro had promised, how she fought. An infant remembers its mother's hands, and Reck's infant self had watched Yvonne in her own court doing the cold work of a noble of the unyielding seat. And now the grown Reck had those memories back, her tactics, her tells, the way a shape-shifting mythic hid among a host, the way she overextended when she was certain she'd already won. He knew his mother now, not as a wound, but as an opponent. And that knowing was a blade. And he remembered the court itself, remembered watching uncomprehending infant that he'd been, one of the great powers of the unyielding seat at some cold amusement, and understood only now, grown, what he'd seen. He had seen the sovereign's kind eat. He had seen how a tile-devouring thing did its devouring, and, this mattered more than any of it, he had seen that even the unmade could be made sick. There had been a lesser power at the court that Yvain had poisoned with something, some infernal contagion planted in a tile it swallowed, so that the great cold thing sickened from the inside on the very soul it had devoured. An infection. A worm in the ante. His mother had done it to a rival, casually, cruelly, as a lesson to her infant son that the strong were only strong until someone taught their strength to turn on them. Reck came back to himself in the chapel, with his whole life in him for the first time, and knew 3 things he had not known an hour before. He knew how to fight his mother because he'd watched her fight before he could walk. He knew how to hurt a thing that eats souls because he'd seen it done. And he knew, gathered, remembering, no longer a boy who did not know his own name, exactly how much he had chosen when he turned away from his own tile on the causeway, and exactly why he'd choose it again. "I'm still torn," he said to Penvarro, rising. His voice was steady. "The tile's still hers, but I know who I am now, all of me, all the way down. And I know how she fights. And I know how to make the sovereign choke on what it eats." He looked toward the vast, woven light hanging over the fallen city,
The arena of the gods waiting to be filled. One piece short. But I'll go into that contest gathered, and I'll take the last piece off her belt when I get there, or I'll die trying. And either way, I'll die knowing my own name. He almost smiled.
That's more than I had this morning. In the corrupted palazzo, collared and founts bound in the dark, Basto Hintaldi refocused his soul. He did it the way he did everything, by reading the board past his own despair. Hecabe had made her second mistake by keeping a scholar caged. She had jailed him among the court's plunder, and the court had plundered the heights, and the heights had held in its dusty archive tiles the accumulated teachings of every discipline Vaunt had ever refined into memory, including one Basto had only ever heard named as a curiosity, the breath and stillness practice of the old wind-stare ascetics, who had held that a soul was not a fixed thing but a focus, and that a focus could be sharpened. In the dark, founts-bound, with nothing to do but plan and grieve, Basto took the ascetic's discipline off a stolen archive tile and turned it on himself. He could not reach his founts through the cold iron collar. But the collar bound the founts, not the soul, and the soul was what the wind-stare discipline worked upon. Night after night in the dark, Basto sat with his breath and his grief and did the slow, terrible work of refocusing, gathering everything scattered in him, the fear Tibin had bred, and the contempt his brothers had bred, and the raw wound of Esme, and grinding it all to a single point, the way a lens grinds light. He did not smother the grief, he aimed it, and a soul aimed is a soul elevated. Grade by grade, in a dark cell, with no shards and no smith and no fount he could touch, Basto Hintaldi climbed by pure discipline toward heights his cast-off reliquary had never dreamed of. Up past prized, past radiant, toward the mythic. Because it turned out that the thing Tibin could never teach, the belief that he was permitted to win, was the only fuel a refocusing needed, and captivity and grief had finally burned everything else away. When he was ready, he was not gentle, because the thing he meant to do did not permit gentleness. He waited for the night the court convened for the gods' contest, when Hecabe and Malco went to answer the paired powers' summons and left their trophies and their prisoners lightly held. And he took the collar off, not by force, he had no force, but by the reading eye, having watched for weeks exactly which gray thing carried the key and exactly when its attention lapsed. And the moment the cold iron came off his throat, his refocused soul came alight in the dark like a struck lamp, mythic and terrible, and aimed. He went for the shelf of trophies first, not for himself, for her. Esme's tile was where it had been, small and warm among the court's cold plunder, and Basto took it up in both hands and felt the frightened, half-formed shade inside it flinch from him the way Reck's child shade had flinched. A girl newly harvested, forgetful, no longer knowing her own name, curled around the raw edge of her own unmaking. He did not have time to heal her. That would take the gods themselves, or a power he did not yet possess. But he had time to hold her, to close his refocused soul around her stolen tile and promise the frightened thing inside it, silently, in the language beneath language that souls speak to souls, that she was not lost, that she was held, that he was coming to make her whole. And the frightened shade, though it did not know his name or its own, knew that, knew it was held for the first time since Malco's harvest, and steadied a little in his hands. "I have you," Basto said into the dark, to the girl who could not yet hear him. "I told you I'd get you back. Now I'm going to go and finish the other half of it." He slid Esme's tile into the torn open place his own refocusing had left in his reliquary, so that she rode at the very center of him, safe as he could make her, and he went out of the cell and up out of the corrupted palazzo toward the arena of light, mythic and aimed and unafraid, with the whole board finally reading toward a single lay he had planned in the dark for weeks. Malco. The vampire lord who had killed the girl he loved and worn her as a trophy, would be in the gods' contest. Because the court's champions all would be. And Basto Hintaldi meant to meet him there. The firmament amphitheater held the whole of Vaunt in its tiers of light, and the whole of the court, and the marsh and the steppe besides. Every soul the gods could gather to witness the play for the world. Onto its floor of woven radiance the champions came, of the living and the harvested dead, and the paired powers set the brackets, and the greatest contest in the history of the lagoon began. Basto walked onto the floor, a mythic power that no one in the tiers recognized. The last most of Vaunt had seen of the Hintaldi boy, he was a minor house's studious son with a cast-off reliquary. The thing that walked out onto the gods' arena now moved with the terrible aimed stillness of a lens focusing light, and the crowd murmured, not knowing him. And Corvallo Serracin, freed of Lucrezia's thrall but not of his own contempt, present as a champion of the houses, sneered from across the sand and did not understand yet that the board had changed under him entirely. Basto did not care about Corvallo. Basto was reading the floor for one pale shape, and he found it. Malco came onto the arena the way he moved through everything, like cold water, a lord of the unyielding seat, wearing the fine harvest of a fallen city. And at his belt, still, casually, hung the small warm tile he had not yet noticed was gone, because Basto had left a lesser trophy in its place, and Malco had not troubled to check. The vampire lord's reliquary was a horror of harvested souls, radiant and prized, the plundered dead of the heights refined into a champion's arsenal, and he looked across the floor at the unknown mythic who had drawn him in the brackets, and smiled the way a strong thing smiles at a meal. The paired powers gave the sign. The play began. Basto did not fight the way Reck fought, with fury, and he did not fight the way the court fought, with cold, profligate power. He fought the way he had always fought, 3 lays ahead, forcing the hand and punishing what he'd forced. But now with a mythic soul behind the reading eye, and with a grief ground to a single, terrible point, and with Esme riding at the center of him where he could feel her frightened shade, steadying every time his resolve wavered. Malco called forth harvested shades of appalling grade. Basto read where each would strike before it struck, and at the pause of sorte he had already decided, and he did not flinch. When the vampire lord flung the plundered strength of a whole ruined house at him, Basto spent his tiles like a man who had nothing left to lose, because he did not, and turned each assault, and answered, and advanced. And at the last, when Malco's reliquary was thinning and the vampire lord's confidence had curdled into the first cold surprise of a predator that has misjudged its prey, Basto called forth the tile that his house had left him, the one strong thing in a cast-off reliquary, the ancestral legendary that his grasping brothers had somehow overlooked because it was old and unfashionable, and its shade did not glitter. Dallo the Warden, a broad gray figure of light, an ancestor of the Hintaldi from an age when the house had meant something, a protector's shade whose whole nature was to stand between. And Basto sent Dallo not to attack, but to shield, to plant himself immovable before the frightened tile at Basto's center, so that Malco, lunging at last with everything he had left for the killing lay, threw his whole diminished strength against a warden whose entire refined soul was the refusal to let harm past. Dallo held. And in the moment Malco's assault broke against the warden's gray, immovable light, overextended and spent and open, Basto Hintaldi stepped past his own ancestor's shielding shade and put the killing lay through the exact center of the thing that had murdered the girl he loved. He did not gloat. He had planned this in the dark for weeks, and there was no joy in it when it came, only a cold completing rightness, like the last piece of a proof. Malco, the vampire lord of the unyielding seat, looked down at the light going through him with the same faint surprise Lucrezia had worn, the surprise of a predator undone by prey.
and unmade, harvested plunder scattering, the stolen dead of the heights loosed back into the arena's light to find whatever rest the gods allowed them. And where he had stood, there was nothing. And at Basto's center, Esme's frightened shade felt her killer end, and steadied, and for the first time since the harvest seemed almost to remember her own name.
"That's the first half," Basto said quietly, to the tile at his center, in the roar of a crowd that had just learned who the Hintaldi boy had become. "He's paid. Now we get you whole." He looked across the arena of light, past the fallen court champions and the sneering, displaced air, and the whole spectacle of the gods' contest, to where a torn boy from the drowning quarter was walking onto the sand to meet a pale, flickering shape that carried his stolen soul at her belt. The brackets had narrowed. The court's lieutenants had fallen. The plundered dead were freed. The human side of the play had won its ground. Only two foes stood now between Vaunt and the ante of the world. The demoness who had killed the Doge, and the sovereign who would unmake them all. And it was Reck's turn. Yvonne was waiting for him on the floor of light, and she was smiling, because she did not yet know what he had gotten back. Little Cinder. She flickered between her forms, cold and beautiful in each, and at her belt, where Basto's eye had found Esme, where Reck's whole torn center had lunged the moment he walked onto the sand, hung a single tile, glazed in a color no other tile in the world wore. The seed of himself. His own stolen soul. "You came. I confess I did not think you would. I thought you would hide in your drowning quarter and let the sovereign eat your friends, and spare yourself the disappointment of learning you were never strong enough to take back what I hold." She spread flickering hands. "But here you are, torn and gathered and brave, come to play your mother for your own soul. It will make a fine spectacle. The gods do love a tragedy." "You overextend," Reck said, "when you're certain you've already won." Yvonne went still. It was only a flicker, quickly closed, but he saw it, because he had watched her all his life without knowing it, and knew her tells now the way he knew his own hands. "What did you say?" "You heard me. You reach too far when you think it's finished. You did it to a rival in your own court when I was too small to walk, and you're going to do it to me here, because you can't help it, because you've never once believed anything you made could beat you." Reck reached for the black cinder fount, and it came up clean and whole, and answered him without tearing anything, because a soul that remembers itself is a strong soul. "I got my past back, Mother. All of it. The court, your hands, the way you fight. I know you now." The play began, and it was the hardest thing Reck had ever done, and he had turned down his own soul on a broken causeway. She was mythic, and he was one grade short of it, torn where she was whole, and by every reckoning of grade and power she should have ended him in the first exchange. She nearly did. Yvain called forth shades out of the unyielding seat that had no names in the mortal tongue. Cold, flickering horrors that came at Reck from angles a mortal fighter would not have thought to guard. But he was not fighting as a mortal. He was fighting as the son who had watched her from the cradle. And each time a horror came from a wrong angle, Reck had already decided at the pause, because he'd seen his mother favor that exact deceit before he could speak. He bled tiles. He spent everything Skell had smuggled him, every shard-fed cinder shade he'd forged in the drowning dark, and he gave ground and gave ground and made her reach. And he was not alone on the sand. Targoth was there. The warlord of the steppe had been drawn into the contest as a champion. The gods gathered all who mattered, and Targoth had spent the last of his host and the whole of his pride against the Doge, and lost. And had watched a thing come out of the rent that would eat his people's souls along with everyone else's, and had made, in his weathered hunting bird way, the same calculation Marta had made in the Sump, that the torn boy from the drowning quarter was the one power in Vaunt worth standing behind, because he was the only one looking at the whole board, and not just his own tier. When Yvonne finally overreached, lunging with a mythic horror for what she was certain was Reck's killing blow, exactly as Reck had baited her to, exactly as she'd taught him she would. It was Targoth's savage step shade that came in from her blind flank and pinned the overextended horror, tangled it, held it the half-second Reck needed. His mother, for one instant, was open. Reck did not kill her. That was the thing he had decided in the drowning dark, the thing that broke the cycle, and it was harder than killing would have been. He drove through the opening and struck not at Ivane, but at her reliquary, at the cold, flickering store of her power, and with the whole of his gathered black fount he shattered it, unmade her arsenal, cracked the tiles of the unyielding seat, left the noble of the cold court suddenly and utterly powerless on the arena of light, a flickering shape with nothing left to flicker with. She fell to her knees on the woven radiance. She, who had killed a god, knelt before her torn son with her power in ruins, and for the first time in his life, Reck saw his mother afraid. "You could have killed me," she said. Her voice had lost its warm, terrible certainty. "Why didn't you kill me?" The paired powers spoke then, braided from all around the arena. She cannot remain. A power that has broken the bargain, that murdered the god who kept it, cannot walk in the kept world. Champion, the ruling is yours to enact. Strip her soul tile. Cast her down into the oblivion she would have given you, or nothing, Reck said. He was crying again, he found, the way he'd cried on the causeway, and it changed nothing. He crossed the sand to where his mother knelt, broken, and he reached, not for her throat, not for the killing the gods offered him and half of him wanted. He reached for her belt, for the little tile glazed in the color no other tile wore, and he took back his own stolen soul out of his mother's keeping, with a hand that shook and did not stop. "You said I'd never be strong enough to take it from you." He held the tile up between them, his own center, 16 years missing, warm as a coal in his palm. "You were wrong about that, the way you were wrong about everything. But I'm not going to do to you what you did to me. I'm not going to unmake you, and I'm not going to cast you into nothing." He looked at the broken thing that had grown him for a purpose and abandoned him to rot, and offered him wholeness only when he'd turned out valuable. "I'm going to take back what's mine and leave you torn, powerless, kept alive, made to live in a world you tried to end, remembering that the thing you threw away beat you and spared you. That's worse than killing you. I learned that from you, Mother. It's the only thing you ever taught me worth keeping." And he pressed his own soul tile to the wound at his center, over the torn place he had carried his whole life, and reached inward past the black fount and let the tile drink. Let the stolen seed of himself sink at last into the ground that had been broken for it and waiting for it for 16 years. And it bonded. It took. It grew into the wound not as a forged replacement, but as the true thing returning. And Reck of the drowning Sump was, for the first time in his remembered life, whole. The wholeness went through him like the Doge's radiance made his own. The black cinder fount, which had always been a wound leaking darkness, became, with the soul it had been starving for finally in place, a thing complete, terrible, elevated. The infernal half of him and the human half of him, and the god's blood in him all at once gathered into a single, unified soul that surged up past mythic in a heartbeat. Because a torn thing made whole does not climb the grades one rung at a time. He stood on the arena of the gods with his whole self in him, and his mother broken at his feet, and Targoth grim at his flank. And above them all, in the coal-lit sky, The last and largest thing turned its vast, cold, hollow attention onto the boy who had just made himself whole. Ox, the unmade sovereign, had watched a champion take back a soul, and found the sight distasteful. "Now," Reck said, whole and formidable, and afraid and resolute all at once, and looked up at the absence wearing a crown.
Now the real one.
The unmade sovereign came down onto the floor of light, and the floor did not dim in deference the way it had for the Doge. It frayed, the woven radiance unmaking a little wherever the vast cold hollow passed, as if a god's own arena could not fully hold the thing that had come to end the gods. "Ho," Axe said. Its voice was the sound of the last tile in the world being eaten, and it was almost gentle, almost kind, the way Ivane's had been kind, the way every power that had ever offered Reck his freedom in exchange for everyone he loved had been kind. "You took back your soul. How it must please you, torn thing. And what is it you have won? A seat at the gods' table, a tile among their trophies. You have fought your way so bravely into your own cage, and you call the cage wholeness." The great absence turned its crown toward the roaring tears, toward the whole watching city. "Do you know what I offer, all of you? Not conquest, not a throne. I have no use for thrones. I offer the one freedom your gods have hoarded away since the first age. The freedom to end. Your worthy dead are not at rest. They are refined, kept, played, passed hand to hand in pretty contests for the pleasure of the powers above you. Your unworthy dead, the hollow crown tilted toward the Sump's drowned quarter. Those the gods did not even trouble to keep. Those simply gone, unhonored, while the rich became medallions. I would end the whole obscene arrangement. I would eat every kept soul and every hoarded tile until nothing is held anymore, until death is death, and free and clean, until your gods rule over an empty shelf. That is not destruction, torn thing. That is mercy. Stand aside, and let me be merciful." And Reck felt it, the pull of it, the same pull as the soul tile held out over the rent, the seductive rightness of a power telling him that the world he'd bled for was a cage, and the kind thing would be to burn it. He had watched the poor die into nothing while the rich were kept. He of all people had cause to hate the bargain. The sovereign had built its whole seduction, like Ivan, in the one blind spot of the person it was seducing. Reck's own lifelong rage at the sorting of Vaunt's dead. "You're right about the arrangement," Reck said. His whole soul was in his voice now, all of it, whole. "It's cruel. The rich become tiles, and the poor become water. And I've hated it my whole life, and I'll spend my whole life trying to mend it. You're right about the cage." He set his feet on the fraying light. "But you're doing the same thing my mother did, and the Doge did, and every power over me ever did. You looked at something wrong in the world, and you decided the answer was to unmake everyone it ever touched. Esme's in that shelf you want to empty. Every drowned child of the Sump who left no tile. You're not freeing them. They're already gone. There's nothing to free. You just want to make the kept ones as gone as the drowned ones and call the emptiness fair." He was shaking and steady both. "I don't want death to be a shelf of trophies for the rich. I want it to be a shelf that holds everyone. You want to smash the shelf. That's not mercy. That's just the last power in the world offering me freedom if I'll burn down everyone who ever mattered. I'm done buying that." "Then you die kept," said the sovereign, and the play began. It was not a play. It was survival against a thing that ate the game itself. Ajax did not call shades and lay rights in the courtly measure of the amphitheater. It devoured,
reached into the arena's light and into Reck's own called shades and unmade them, ate them into the true nothing, so that every tile Reck spent was simply gone, not defeated but erased, and no strategy of grade or measure could stand against a foe that removed your pieces from having existed. The crowd's roar turned to a thin animal keening as they understood. The thing could not be outplayed because it ate the playing. But Reck had watched the court eat before he could walk, and he had gotten that memory back in a drowning chapel, and he knew the two things his gathered soul needed. The first was the self-multiplying shade. Deep in the black Cinder fount, now whole and answering him fully, was a thing his infernal blood could do that no mortal contestant could. Call forth not one shade, but a seed of one. An infernal figure that, when the sovereign devoured it, did not simply vanish, but split, each unmaking spawning two more in the eating, so that the more Ajax ate, the more there were to eat. An infernal hydra of the pit that turned the sovereign's own devouring against it. Reck flooded the fraying arena with them, self-doubling, endless, and Ajax ate, and the eating multiplied its problem, the vast, cold hollow now beset by a thing that grew from its own hunger. And the second was the worm in the ante. Reck had watched his mother poison a rival of the court by feeding it a tile with an infernal contagion curled inside. Had watched a thing that ate souls sicken on the very soul it swallowed. Yvain knelt broken at the arena's edge, powerless, her reliquary shattered. But a shattered reliquary still held fragments, cracked shards of the unyielding seat's cold power. And Reck, whole now, and formidable, and thinking 3 lays ahead the way Basto had taught him without ever meaning to, took up the broken shards of his mother's tiles and wove them into the heart of his self-multiplying shades, so that every infernal figure the sovereign devoured carried, curled inside it, a fragment of the unyielding seat's own poison. Axe ate the hydra. The hydra multiplied, and each thing it ate seeded the vast cold hollow with a contagion out of its own court. A worm in every swallowed soul, so that the unmade sovereign, for the first time in an existence older than Vaunt, began from the inside to sicken on its own hunger. It took everything. It took the whole of Reck's gathered soul and the last of his mother's broken power, and the warlord's grim flanking, and the patrician's reading eye shouted across the sand, "It overcommits when it feeds, Reck. It can't stop eating. Make it eat!" And it took hours, or what felt like hours in the god's frozen light. But grade could not save a thing that devoured pieces from existing, and neither could a thing that devoured survive a meal that multiplied and poisoned it at once. The unmade sovereign, beset by an infernal hydra grown from its own hunger and rotting from within on the contagion of its own court, at last grew slow, and then still, and then began, hollow crown first, to come apart. Not unmade, for it could not be unmade by its own weapon, but undone, sickened past holding, collapsing inward into the coal-lit nothing it had wanted to give the whole world. "You wanted an empty shelf," Reck said, whole and swaying and spent past bearing, to the collapsing absence. "Go be empty by yourself." And the sovereign fell into its own oblivion, and the rent shuddered, and the vast cold hollow that had come to end the gods was ended, banished, undone, put down into the freedom it had offered everyone else, and the arena of light rang with the passing of it, and every kept soul in the shelf of the world, Esme's among them, was saved from the unmaking. Vaunt was saved. The court was broken. The existential thing was ended. And the paired powers from all around the ringing arena spoke once more, and Reck, whole and spent, and sure the worst was behind him, realized with a slow, cold dread that it was not. Because there was one question the greatest contest had not yet answered, one ante still on the table. and it had never been the sovereign or the court at all. "The threat to the order is ended," the braided voices said. "The bargain stands. The kept are kept. The shelf holds all who earned it. There remains only this. Vaunt has no god. Its doge is dead, its heir unfit, its houses hollow. A city cannot be left without a hand, and we do not give thrones to the strongest. The strongest was the sovereign. And see what it would have done with the world? We give thrones to the worthy. 2 champions remain in this contest who might wear the light of Vaunt. Let them play. Let the last play decide who shall be its doge. And the ante shall be the city itself." And across the fraying floor of light, spent and grieving and mythic, and holding a girl at the center of him who had almost remembered her name, Basto Hintaldi turned to face the torn boy he had once handed a tile to in the sand, and understood that the gods meant the 2 of them to play for Vaunt, against each other, at the end of the longest day the world had ever known. They were given a night before the last play. The gods, whatever else they were, understood spectacle, and the contest for a city was better savored than rushed. The firmament amphitheater dimmed to a held breath of light, and the champions were let down into the waking world to rest. And Reck did not rest. He went to the one place in Vaunt he had ever been able to think. Penvaro's chapel was half drowned as ever, and the old keeper was awake, as if he had known Reck would come. Reck knelt on the wet stones where he had knelt to merge with his child self, and for a while he could not say anything at all. "I can't do it," he said finally. "I can't play him for the city." "You are afraid you will lose?" "I'm afraid I'll win." The words came out of him like something torn. "Penvaro, I turned down a throne once already, over the rent, because taking it meant walking away from everyone I loved. And now the gods are going to hand me the same throne if I can beat the one person who stood by me longest. And I keep seeing the doge, my father. I've got his blood in me, the blood of a thing that ruled a city for centuries by opening people with a word and staging pretty lights over the poor while they drowned. I've got her blood in me, a thing that grows children for a purpose and throws them away. That's what I'm made of. That's the 2 halves of me, whole now. And you want to put a city in my hands?" He was shaking. "What if I mend the Sump for a year, and then start believing I know best? What if I take the founder tiles and hold the houses hostage the way he did, for good reasons, the way everyone with power always has, good reasons? I've watched every powerful thing in this city, and every one of them was a monster who thought they were being kind. My mother thought she was being kind. The sovereign thought it was being merciful. What in the world makes me think I'm any different from the things I'm made of?" Penvaro was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, it was not comfort. "Nothing," the old keeper said. "Nothing makes you different from what you are made of. You have your father's blood and your mother's blood, and the black fount of the pit, and you could become every monster you have named. That is all true, and you are right to fear it, and I will not tell you that you are safe." He leaned forward on his stick. "But hear an old man who has read a great many souls. The doge never once asked the question you are asking. The sovereign never asked it. Your mother never asked it. Not one of the powers that ruled you ever knelt on a wet floor the night before their triumph and said, 'What if I become a monster?' That question, Reck, that fear, the very thing you are drowning in, is the one safeguard none of them had. A man who is terrified of becoming a tyrant is watching for it. A man who is certain of his own kindness is already halfway there." He set his old hand over Reck's whole soul, the way he had over the torn one. "You asked me once, in this chapel,
Strong for what? You have been answering it ever since. Every time you chose the drowning city over your own wholeness. You are the only power this city has ever produced that looks down. Marta told you as much, and she was right. Vaunt does not need a ruler who is sure he is good. It has had those. They are gods, and they are monsters. It needs a ruler who sees the beggars at the edges of the square and is afraid of what he might do to them. That is you, child.
The fear is not the disqualification. The fear is the whole qualification.
Reck knelt in the wet chapel light and let that settle into the place his soul had only just learned to be whole enough to hold it. "He's my friend," he said, quieter. "Basto. He handed me back a tile when I was nothing. He's the reason I know how to read a board. If we play for the city, one of us has to lose it. And I don't want to win it from him." "Then that too is an answer," Penvaro said. "And a better one than you know. Go and meet him honestly. Do not throw the play out of guilt. That would insult you both. Play him true, all the way. Hold nothing back. And let the gods and Basto Hintaldi both see exactly who you are when you do not flinch. You have spent your whole life certain you were the broken thing, the torn thing, the thing not permitted to win." The old man almost smiled.
Go and find out what you are when you are whole and afraid, and playing your dearest friend for the fate of everyone you love. I think you will find you are not your father, and not your mother, and not the pit. I think you will find you are only Reck of the drowning quarter, who never once in his life left a boy in the flood. Go and let him see it. Reck rose from the wet stones. The fear was still in him. Penvaro had not taken it, had told him to keep it, that it was the whole qualification. But it had changed shape, from a thing that unmade him into a thing that steadied him, the way grief had changed shape in Basto. He went out of the half-drowned chapel into the last of the night, whole and afraid and resolved, and turned his steps back up toward the arena of light where a city waited on its ante, and a friend waited to test him for it. "All right," he said, to the empty tears, to the sleeping Sump, to whatever of his two dead and living parents might be listening. "Let's find out what I am." The firmament amphitheater woke to its full radiance for the last play, and all of Vaunt woke with it, the heights and the middens and the drowning Sump, the levee and the marsh and the scattered steppe. Every soul the longest day had gathered, held frozen and wondering in the tears of light, while two boys walked out onto the floor to play for the world. The ante was named a final time, and it was the city itself. Whoever won this play would be the luminous doge of Vaunt. They met at the center of the woven radiance, the torn and mended thief and the refocused patrician, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because everything worth saying had been said on a muddy rampart a war ago. "I don't want to win it from you," Reck said at last, low, so the gods and the crowd could not hear. "I know." Basto's aimed mythic stillness cracked, just once, into the wry, studious boy who had handed a stranger a tile in the sand. "And I don't want to hand it to you out of love, because you'd never forgive me, and you'd be right not to. So we do the thing properly. We play true, all the way, and we find out." He almost smiled. "You read a board better than you think you do, Reck of No House. I taught you that. Don't insult me by going easy." The paired powers gave the sign. It was the finest play that had ever been made in Vaunt, and no one who witnessed it ever forgot it. And it was not, in the end, about tiles at all. Reck brought the whole of his gathered soul, the black cinder fount whole and terrible, the self-multiplying shades of the pit, the god's blood radiance that had surged up in him when his own soul tile bonded home. Basto brought the reading eye that had never lost a board it fully saw, The refocused mythic discipline ground out of grief in a dark cell. Dallow, the warden, standing immovable at his center beside the girl who was almost remembering her name. Fury against measure.
The pit against the lens. They had held the marsh wall together exactly this way, the fire and the reading eye, and now they turned it on each other. And it was beautiful and terrible and perfectly, agonizingly matched. Because each of them knew the other's game better than his own. Reck forced the hand. Basto had read the forcing and punished it. Basto set a trap 3 lays deep. Reck, who had learned trap reading from the man setting it, walked the edge of it and turned it back. They spent tiles like men with nothing to lose because neither had anything left to hold back. And the crowd of a frozen city watched 2 boys from opposite ends of the world's cruelest ladder play each other to a standstill for the right to mend it. And at the last it came down to the thing the whole longest day had been about. The thing Tibbin had named in a practice loft an age ago and could never teach. The flinch.
Basto saw the opening first, the reading eye, always 1 lay ahead, and he took it because he had promised to play true, and a true play does not hesitate. He called forth the killing lay, Dallow and his whole refocused mythic soul behind it, and sent it at Reck with everything he had, a blow that would end the play and take the city and leave Reck defeated on the arena of the gods. It came at Reck's exact center, at the whole soul he had bled the world to make. And Reck did not flinch. He could have shielded. He had a tile in reach that would have turned it. The paws of Sorta hung open, and he had always already decided, and what he had decided was to stand, to let Basto's killing lay come at his whole undefended soul, and to meet it not with a shield, but with himself, planted, unmoving, refusing to give the city the sight of the Sump boy flinching from a friend's honest blow. He stood in the path of the thing that could unmake him, and did not raise a hand, and looked at Basto down the length of it, and let his friend see that he would rather lose the play whole and standing than win it by flinching. Basto's lay stopped a hair from Reck's heart. It stopped because Basto stopped it, because in the instant before it landed, the reading eye that was always 1 lay ahead read the last board of all, and saw the thing it had been playing the whole day to see. Reck had not flinched. Reck, offered the throne over the rent, had turned it down for love. Reck, offered his own soul, had turned it down for the drowning city. Reck, given every reason and every power to become his father or his mother, had knelt on a wet chapel floor the night before his triumph, and wept with terror at the thought of becoming a tyrant. And now Reck stood on the arena of the gods, and would not flinch from a killing blow, because flinching would have been a lie about who he was. That was the whole test. Basto had come to the last play not to win a city, but to read one, to see, with the truest eye Vaunt had ever produced, which of them the broken lagoon actually needed on its throne. And the reading eye had its answer. Basto let the lay die a hair from Reck's heart, and stepped back and lowered his hands. "There it is," he said, and his voice carried now, thrown by the god's own light to every frozen soul in Vaunt. "That's the doge this city needs. Not the strongest. The sovereign was the strongest, and it would have unmade us all. Not the surest. My father was the surest, and he ruled us with a whip of light, and grew a war to blood his sons. Him." He pointed, and the whole city followed his hand to the torn and mended thief from the drowning quarter. "A boy who was handed nothing and given nothing and sorted to the bottom of every ladder we built, who turned down a throne and turned down his own soul and stood here just now and would not flinch from me because flinching would have been a lie. Vaunt has been ruled by gods and monsters. I have played it, and I have read it, and I tell you it needs to be ruled by the one man in it who is afraid of ruling, who looks down, who sees the beggars at the edges,
who pulled a boy out of the flood when the whole city's arithmetic said, "Let him drown." And then Basto Hintaldi did the thing that no one, not even the gods, had known was in him to do. Because the refocusing in the dark cell had elevated him past mythic into something the old records had a name for, and the living had forgotten. A champion, whose grief and discipline and truest eye had ground his soul to a point so pure that his word itself had weight in the world. An arbiter, one whose pronouncement, spoken true on the arena of the gods, bound what it named. Basto Hintaldi knelt, the first man of a founding house to kneel to a boy of no house at all, and lifted his refocused arbiter's soul, and pronounced it, and his word went out over the frozen city and bound. I name you luminous Doge of Vaunt. I concede the play, and the city, and the throne. Rise, Reck of the Sump, rise, and be our light. The paired powers, from all around the ringing arena, spoke the seal. So the arbiter names, so the contest ends. So it is bound. The champion has read true. Vaunt has its Doge. And Reck stood on the arena of the gods, whole, unflinching, tears on his face. A city in his hands he had never once schemed to take. Looking down at his dearest friend kneeling in the light, and understood that he had won the throne in the only way he could ever have borne to hold it.
Not by taking it, but by being handed it by the one man wise enough to know that some plays should not be won, and generous enough to lose the greatest of them on purpose, for love of a friend and a broken city both. Get up, Reck said for the second time in his life, to someone kneeling. His voice shook and did not stop. I don't kneel, people. There's been enough of that. He reached down and pulled Basto to his feet, the way he'd pulled Bram from the flood. The way the whole long day had been teaching him was the only kind of power worth having. There's been enough of that in this city, he said, and I mean to end it. Help me. I always have, said Basto Hintaldi, arbiter of Vaunt. And the two of them stood together on the arena of light while a frozen city thawed into a roar that would not stop for an hour. The firmament amphitheater let them go, and the woven light unspooled back into ribbons, and the frozen war and the frozen city thawed all at once. And Reck of the drowning Sump opened his eyes on the great square before the palazzo with the whole of Vaunt around him, and a throne fastened to his name by an arbiter's binding word. The play had been witnessed by everyone. That was the gods' doing, and it turned out to be the making of him. There was no need to explain to the houses that a Sump boy was their Doge, no need to fight for it tier by tier. Every soul in Vaunt had sat frozen in the tears of light, and watched the torn thief turn down his own soul, and refuse to flinch and be named by the truest eye the city had ever produced. They had watched a patrician of a founding house kneel to him. When Reck rose in the great square, filthy and spent and whole, the city that had sorted him to the bottom of every ladder it owned looked at him, and slowly, uncertainly, and then all at once acclaimed him. The Sump loudest of all, the drowning quarter roaring up out of its flooded streets to see one of its own standing in the light where a god had stood. The paired powers set the seal on it with a gift. Out of the last of the arena's radiance, a thing descended into Reck's hands, a scepter of pale worked light, the scepter of concord. And the braided voices named its virtue as they gave it, 1 year's peace, imposed and unbreakable. While the new Doge holds it, no host may march on Vaunt. Every enemy army that stands upon her soil is sent home to its own hearth, and the lagoon is given a year to heal before the world remembers how to be cruel to it. Use the year well, luminous Doge. We do not give another. And it was so. Reck lifted the scepter,
hardly knowing how, and felt the year settle over the city like a drawn breath. And out on the marsh and the scattered causeways, the exhausted remnant of Targoth's steppe host simply turned, the imposed peace taking them by the shoulders and pointing them home. And the warlord himself, who had flanked Reck's mother on the arena and helped pin her, gave one grim hunting bird nod across the emptying field and led his people back into the marsh dark, banished by the gift and not the sword, alive to raid another century, but not this one. The last cold survivors of the unyielding seat's vanguard felt the peace find them too, and were flung back through the guttering rent into their coal-lit court. And the tear in the sky over the causeway, with a sovereign that had torn it wide undone, shuddered and narrowed and closed. Reck stood in the great square with the scepter in his hand and his whole soul in him, and the acclamation of a city washing over a boy who had never once in his life been cheered. And it was almost more than the wholeness could hold. The founts of the world answered him now with a doge's authority. The wholeness and the ordeal, and the scepter's gift had surged him up past mythic into the radiant grade the doges wore. The light of Vaunt kindling in him not by inheritance, but by everything he had bled to become. He did not know how to wear it yet. He suspected he never entirely would, and remembered Penvero saying that not knowing was the whole qualification, and held on to that. They came to him in the square, one by one. The found family, the drowning quarter, had grown around him. Marta, who had held the Sump through the fall of the world and lost fewer of her people than any captain in Vaunt, came and did not kneel because he had told her twice now that he did not kneel people, and only gripped his forearm, hard-handed and plain, and said, "Told you. Nobody up here looks down. Now you're up here. Don't forget which way to look." Skell, with her scarred smith's hands, and Bram grinning through a face still half-healed from the causeway, and old Penvaro leaning on his stick with something in his lined face that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but had room for both. Reck stood among them in the light where a god had stood, and understood that he had not risen out of the Sump so much as brought it up the tiers with him, and that this was the only way he had ever wanted to rise. And then Basto came, with the whole square making way for the arbiter who had crowned a doge, and at Basto's side, unsteady, blinking in the light, with a look on her face like someone waking from a long gray dream and finding the world still there, walked Esme. Reck understood before Basto said a word. The sovereign had been undone before it could empty the shelf of the world. Every kept soul it had meant to devour was saved, and Esme's tile, ridden safe at the center of Basto's refocused soul all through the longest day, had been more than saved. The god's own contest, the ringing of the arena when the unmaking failed, the sheer weight of an arbiter's whole being closed around one small, frightened shade for weeks in the dark, had done what Basto had promised her in a cell she could not hear him in. She was restored, made whole out of her own kept tile. The harvest undone, the girl returned. Not a shade, not a trophy on a vampire lord's belt, but Esme, alive, remembering at last her own name and the name of the boy who had never once stopped saying he would get her back. "You said you'd get me back," she said to Basto, wondering, her voice rusty from the gray dream. "I heard you. At the end. When it was ringing. I heard you." Basto Hintaldi, arbiter of Vaunt, who had ground his grief to a point pure enough to bind the world with a word, put his arms around the girl he had crossed the ending of everything to recover, and for once in the whole long day, found that he had nothing at all to read, and nothing at all to say, and only held her, in the great square, in the light, while a city that had watched him lose a throne on purpose, watched him win back the only thing he had ever actually wanted. Reck watched them, whole and content and unspeakably tired, with a scepter of a year's peace in his hand and a mended soul in his chest, and a drowning quarter cheering his name up out of its flooded streets, and thought that if this was where the longest day had been going all along, to Esme alive, and Basto holding her, and the Sump roaring in the light, and the rent closed in the sky, then the throne he had never schemed to take might, after all, be a thing he could bear to hold. Above the great square, the sky was empty of any god's light. Reck looked up at the emptiness, where his father's radiance had unspooled every evening of his whole drowning childhood, and did not yet know that the emptiness was not quite finished with him. That one last reckoning was even now gathering itself out of the guttering rent, on wings the world did not have a name for, to close an account that had opened in a cradle 16 years before. It came on the third evening after the coronation, when the great square had emptied, and Reck had gone up alone to the high terrace of the palazzo to look at the sky he now absurdly ruled. It came the way weather comes, a change in the pressure of the air, and Reck knew it before he saw it, because the black cinder fount at his whole center twisted toward it the way it had once twisted toward the Doge. That wrongness of recognition, blood knowing blood. The rent had not fully closed. Out of the last of it, up into the empty sky over Vaunt, rose a thing of light and scale that the world had no name for. And the whole lagoon city below cried out and fell to its knees in the streets, because it looked, at first, as if a new god had come. It was vast, vaster than the Doge's nightly procession had ever been, a leviathan of the upper air, a serpent shape of pure elevated radiance, coiling against the coal-lit dusk on wings that were not quite wings, and it turned its enormous burning attention down through the dark and found the small figure on the high terrace. And Reck, who had faced his mother and the sovereign and not run, found that his heart was going like a hunted thing. "You have my throne," the Leviathan said, and its voice was the Doge's voice, and it was not. "Father," Reck said. The word still tasted of the black fount, but it was true, and he had stopped hiding from true things. Ottavio Saracen had not died on the arena where his radiance guttered out. Or he had died, and it had not held, because a radiant power slain in a seizing did not simply end. It was harvested by the very gods whose contest had framed it. And a Doge who had ruled Vaunt for centuries carried too much refined self to be a mere tile. And so the paired powers had done with him the thing they did only with the greatest of the kept dead. They had let him ascend. Slain, harvested, and reborn, a grade past anything the mortal world could hold, up out of radiant into the transcendent that the old records named and the living had never seen. A thing no longer a Doge, no longer a man, no longer even a god of one small lagoon, but a leviathan of the elevated air with an eternity of ascension in front of it and nothing left to keep it here. "You came back," Reck said, "to take it, the city. You always meant to be the only power over it, even dead, even—" He gestured at the vast, coiling radiance. "This." No. The Leviathan's enormous head lowered until its burning eye was level with the terrace, and Reck made himself not step back. "I came back to look at what I made, and to give you the tools to keep it, and to tell you a thing you will hate because it is true and you should have it." The transcendent regard weighed him the way Ivan had once weighed an infant, but there was something in it now that had not been in the Doge, the strange, cold clarity of a thing that has climbed past caring about the game it used to rule. Your mother told you what you are, grown for a purpose. She was not lying, though she never understood the purpose. I did not couple with a demon of the unyielding seat for pleasure, boy.
I did it to make exactly what stands on that terrace. A thing with the blood to sit the throne of Vaunt, and the blood to walk through the rent. A bridge. An heir who could rule the lagoon, and when the time came, be strong enough to follow me up the endless path of ascension. You were never meant to be my rival. You were meant to be my successor, in every sense. The throne first, and then the climb.
And the war? Reck's voice was hard. The steppe, the dead, Esme, nearly. All of it grown, the way I was grown. To force the city up a grade? To blood your successors? Yes. No flicker of shame. The transcendent was past shame the way it was past the throne. A city that is never threatened never rises. I manufactured the war to force elevation, and I would do it again, because the arithmetic is sound, and the alternative is a lagoon of soft heirs who never learn to stand. That is the creed I ruled by for 3 centuries, boy, and it built the greatest of cities. And you may hate it, but you cannot say it failed. It failed Esme, Reck said. It failed every drowned child of the Sump who died into nothing to make your arithmetic sound. It failed me, and the cradle. He found he was not afraid anymore. The fury that came up in him now was the whole, clean fury of a whole soul, and it did not need the black fount to burn. I've heard your creed.
I heard it from my mother, and I heard it from the thing that wanted to unmake the world. And it's the same creed every time. Some must be spent so the rest can rise. And I am the one who decides who. And every single one of you was sure you were being wise. He took the one step forward he had refused to let himself take backward, until he stood at the very lip of the terrace under the vast burning eye of his transcendent father. I'm not going to rule that way. I know that's what you came to hear, and I'm telling you plain. I'm going to rule the opposite way. I'm going to spend a year of the God's peace lifting the Sump out of the water instead of blooding it in a war. I'm going to hold this city by trust, not by fear. And if that makes it softer than your arithmetic likes, then it'll be softer, and it'll be kinder. And I'll take that trade every day you're not here to overrule me. The Leviathan regarded him for a long, long moment, and then it did a thing the Doge had never done in 3 centuries. It conceded, not the throne, which it had already given, but the argument, in the only way a transcendent could, by letting it stand. Perhaps, Saracine said, perhaps a thing built of my arithmetic and her cruelty was always going to grow up into the opposite of both. I did not plan for that. It may be the one thing I did not plan. Something moved in the vast, burning regard that was almost, not warmth, the transcendent was past warmth, but a cold, clean respect, the nearest thing to a father's blessing that a Leviathan of the elevated air had left in it to give. Here then, the tools, as I promised, whatever you do with them. And out of the transcendent's coiling radiance, a cascade of light came down onto the terrace and resolved into tiles, 9 of them, glazed in 9 ancient colors, older and finer than any reliquary in the living city. The ancestor tiles of the 9 founding houses. Reck knew them the moment they touched his hands, knew what they were and what they meant, because the whole cruelty of the city clicked into place around them the way his own life had clicked into place before the rent. The houses obey the Doge because the Doge holds these, Saracine said. I have held them for 3 centuries. Each house's greatest ancestor, the founder tile that is the root of all their pride. I keep them, and so the houses keep faith. Because a house whose founder I could unmake at a word does not rebel. That is how a god rules 9 proud families without ever raising his voice. I give them to you now. Hold them, and the houses are yours. You need never fear a rising from the heights, because you keep their fathers hostage, as I kept them. The burning eye held his. That is the last of my arithmetic, boy. The most useful piece. Do with it what you like. Reck looked down at the 9 ancient tiles in his hands.
the whole secret machinery of Vaunt's obedience, the hostage hearts of 9 proud houses, handed to him as an inheritance and the temptation in the same breath. Hold them, and he would never be threatened. Hold them, and he would rule by exactly the fear he had just sworn to end. His father had given him last of all, the perfect tool for becoming his father. "Thank you," Reck said, and meant it, because he saw the shape of the gift and the shape of the test, both. "I'll keep them safe." "You mean you will give them back?" "I mean I'll keep them safe until I can give them back," Reck said. "1 year of peace. I'm going to spend it lifting the Sump and earning the houses instead of holding them hostage.
And on the last day of it, when I found out whether a city can be held by trust, I'm going to hand 9 proud families their father's hearts back and find out if they've learned to keep faith with a doge who doesn't have a knife to their founders. Maybe they won't have. Maybe I'll have a rising from the heights and lose the throne you bled the world to grow me for." He closed his hands around the 9 tiles, whole and certain. "But I'd rather lose it that way than keep it your way. That's the difference between us, Father. You could never once risk being loved instead of feared. I'm going to spend a whole year risking exactly that." The Leviathan of the elevated air looked at the boy it had grown for a throne and a climb, and found him standing on that throne refusing the climb, and refusing the arithmetic, and refusing, above all, to become the thing that had made him, and the vast, transcendent regard that had ruled a city for 3 centuries, and was past the throne, and past the game, and past warmth, held him a last moment, and then lifted, and turned toward the coal-lit dusk and the endless path beyond it. "The path never ends," Ottavio Seracin said, already rising, already diminishing against the darkening sky. His account with the mortal world and the son he had grown for it closed at last on his own cold terms, and on Reck's. "I have a whole eternity of ascension before me, and no more time for one small lagoon. Rule it as you like, luminous doge. Rule it soft. It is yours. And I find, to my surprise, that I do not mind." And the transcendent Leviathan climbed the empty sky and was gone, up past where the eye could follow, up the endless path, leaving Vaunt and the whole of humanity to the torn and mended thief on the terrace, who stood alone at last under a sky finally, truly empty of any god's light, holding 9 hostage hearts he meant to give away, and a scepter of 1 year's peace, and a whole soul, and a city, and the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of a man who has met every power that ever ruled him, and refused, at the last, to become a single one of them. The Sump did not rise all at once. Nothing worth doing ever did, Reck was learning. And he had a whole year, and he meant to use it the way the gods had told him to use it, and for the exact opposite of what any god would have chosen. The water went first. It turned out that a doge who had been born in the flooded quarter knew precisely which drowned doorstep flooded first and why, and could stand on a high terrace with the whole engineering craft of Vaunt at his command and say, "There, and there, and there," and the canal cutters and the lock builders who had spent centuries keeping the heights dry found themselves for the first time in the city's history sent down to keep the Sump dry instead. Marta ran it. That was the shape the year took, Reck holding the light in the palazzo, and Marta holding the trowel in the Sump. And between them, the flooded quarter that had been the city's drain slowly, stubbornly, becoming a place where a child might grow up without learning first to swim in the dark. She came up the tiers on the last morning of the rebuilding season with mud to her elbows and a set of ledgers under her arm, summoned to the heights by an arbiter's page, and stood in a marble hall she'd have been whipped out of 2 years before, and looked at how the light came through the high glass, and was not overawed, because Marta had never in her life been overawed by anything.
"Basto wants me for the wedding," she said to Reck, half a question. An arbiter's page came down to the Sump to fetch a mud-caked enforcer up to the heights. Half the quarter thought I was being arrested. "Half the quarter always thinks that," Reck said. "He wants you because you rebuilt the thing they said couldn't be rebuilt. And he's the kind of man who thinks the person who did the work should stand where the work is honored. So do I." He looked at the woman who had put his face in the floodwater and then chosen his side while the choosing was worth something.
"You brought the Sump up out of the water, Marta. Come up out of it yourself for a day. Stand in the light. You've more right to it than anyone in this hall was born with." So she came to the wedding, mud scrubbed off and ledgers set down, and stood in the Heights Chapel among founding houses who a year ago would not have let her carry their bags, and no one said a word. Because the Sump-born Doge had made it so that no one dared, and, more slowly, so that no one wished to. Basto and Esme were married in a chapel of the paired powers, with old Penvaro speaking the right, because Basto had asked for the one keeper in Vaunt who had tended the drowning and the dying when it earned him nothing. And Penvaro had wept a little, quietly, in the way of an old man who has read a great many souls and does not often get to see two of them come out whole on the other side of everything. Esme wore her own name like a thing newly precious, because she had spent a season not knowing it. And every time in the rite that Basto said it aloud, she smiled as though hearing it returned to her. The girl who had stood with her house's tiles and made a vampire lord work for her, who had been harvested and worn as a trophy, and ridden safe at the center of a refocused soul through the ending of the world. She married the studious boy who had crossed all of it to say her name back to her. And the whole strange gathered company of them, patrician and Sump-born and arbiter and doge, stood in the light and watched it and knew, in the particular way you know a thing you have nearly lost, exactly what it was worth. Reck stood at the back where he liked to stand, and Bram beside him grinning through a healed face, and Skell with her scarred hands folded, and Marta with mud still under her nails, and watched his dearest friend marry the girl they had crossed the world to keep, and felt the whole long ordeal of it settle in him at last, into something he had never once expected to feel and had no practice at holding. He was content. That was the strange thing, the thing he turned over on the terrace that evening when the feast had wound down and the lanterns were going up along the canals, red and gold, the whole tiered city preening itself, exactly as it had on the festival eve when a starving boy took a dying man's tile in a dead-end alley and could not bond it because his soul was the wrong shape. The city was the same city. The lanterns were the same lanterns. Everything else was different. He was whole where he had been torn. He was the light at the top of the tiers where he had been the water at the bottom. He had a found family instead of a hole where one should have been, and a friend who had crowned him out of love, and a mended soul that answered the founts of the world with a doge's authority, and 9 hostage hearts locked in a strong room that he was going to give back to their houses in the morning, on the last day of the gods' peace, to find out whether trust could hold a city that fear had always held before. Maybe it wouldn't. He knew that. Penvaro had told him to keep the fear, and he had kept it. Somewhere out past the marsh, Targoth's clans were licking their wounds and remembering the taste of the causeway. And somewhere below the world, the rent still whispered in its coal-lit dark. And the year of imposed peace had a last day, and after it, the world would remember how to be cruel to a soft lagoon ruled by a Sump-born boy who gave away his own leverage. New threats would come. They always came. The path never ended. His father had said so, climbing an empty sky, and for once the two of them had not disagreed. But that was tomorrow's arithmetic, and the day after's. And Reck of the Drowning Quarter had spent 16 years unable to afford a single evening that was only good. He meant to afford this one.
He stood on the high terrace of a palace he had never schemed to take, over a city that had sordid him to the bottom, and then, having watched him refuse every power that ever ruled it, lifted him to the top. And he watched the lanterns come up gold along the water, all the way down the tiers, all the way down to the Sump, where a woman with mud under her nails was making a drowned quarter into a place where children need not learn to swim in the dark. He watched the light reach, for the first time in the city's whole cruel history, all the way to the bottom. Somewhere below, the drowning quarter was drying out.
Somewhere above, his dearest friend slept beside the girl they had crossed the ending of everything to keep. Somewhere past the world, a demoness lived on, torn and powerless in a world she had tried to unmake. And a transcendent father climbed an endless sky. And the two halves of what Reck was made of went on being what they were, and could not touch him, because he had met them both and chosen, all the way down, to be neither. He was Reck of the Sump, luminous doge of Vaunt, whole and afraid and content, and he had never once left a boy in the flood. And he did not mean to start now, though the flood be a whole city and the boy be all of them. The lanterns burned gold down every tier to the mended water. Reck watched them a long while and was glad, and let the year's last quiet evening be only good.